What does it mean to be Russian? Where did Russia begin? To answer that, we have to travel back in time. Way back, before there was a Kremlin, before there were Tsars, even before the name Russia existed. Our story starts not with a nation, but with a vast, sprawling land, a canvas of endless plains, dense forests, and winding rivers. This is the stage where the first act of Russian history will unfold. Long before the Slavs, who we often think of as the ancestors of modern Russians, this land was dominated by other peoples. Imagine the great Eurasian steppe, a sea of grass stretching from Eastern Europe to Central Asia. This was the domain of the Scythians, a powerful nomadic people who thundered across the plains on horseback around the 7th century BC. They were fierce warriors, masters of the bow, and skilled goldsmiths, leaving behind a legacy not of cities or written laws, but of treasure-filled burial mounds. Called these kurgans, the landscape of modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, silent monuments to a lost civilization. The Scythians were a force of nature, a whirlwind of nomadic life. But like the wind, they eventually faded, leaving the stage open for new actors. After the Scythians and other nomadic groups, like the Sarmatians and the Goths, came and went, a different kind of people began to shape the land. These were the Slavs. Unlike the horse lords of the steppe, the early Slavs were people of the forest and the river. From around the 6th century AD, they began a massive expansion from their original homeland, which historians believe was somewhere in modern-day Poland, Belarus, or Ukraine. They were farmers, hunters, and fishermen, living in small, scattered communities. They cleared forests to plant their crops, built humble wooden villages, and navigated the intricate network of rivers that crisscrossed the land. These rivers were their highways, their lifelines. The Dnieper, the Don, the Volgalis weren't just bodies of water. They were the arteries that would pump life into the future state. The Slavs were divided into many different tribes. The Drevlians, the Siberians, each with its own customs. But they shared a common language and a common pagan faith, worshipping gods of nature, thunder, and the sun. For centuries, these Slavic tribes lived in relative isolation. But the world was about to come to them, and it would arrive by water. From the north, from the cold lands of Scandinavia, came a new and formidable force. They were known to the Slavs as the Varangians. We know them better as Vikings. These weren't just raiders and pirates, though they were certainly good at both. They were also savvy merchants and incredible explorers. In their iconic longships, they sailed down from the Baltic Sea, entering the vast river systems of Eastern Europe. They were searching for a route to the richest cities in the world, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. This route, which stretched from the Baltic all the way down to the Black Sea, became known as the trade route from the Varangians. To the Greeks, it was a grueling, dangerous journey. The Varangians would drag their ships overland between river systems in what were called portages. Along the way, they traded with the Slavic tribes. They offered swords, axes, and jewelry in exchange for furs, honey, wax, and, tragically, slaves captured from other tribes. This interaction was a mix of commerce and conflict. The Varangians built forts along the rivers to protect their trade, and at times, they demanded tribute from the local Slavic populations. They were a powerful, organized military force in a land of scattered, often warring tribes. A new power dynamic was emerging, one that would change the destiny of this entire region. According to a historical account written centuries later, the Primary Chronicle, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the north grew tired of fighting amongst themselves. The chronicle tells us that they drove the Varangians back across the sea, but soon found that they couldn't govern themselves. Anarchy and infighting returned. So, in a truly remarkable moment, the chronicle claims the tribes decided to invite a foreign ruler to bring order. They sent an embassy overseas to the Varangians, to a people called the Rus, with a famous message: "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." Whether this invitation actually happened as described is a subject of intense debate among historians. Some think it's a later invention to legitimize a foreign dynasty's rule. Others believe it reflects a real event where Slavic elites hired Viking mercenaries to protect them and enforce order. Whatever the exact truth, the result was the same. Around the year 862, three Varangian brothers, led by a chieftain named Rurik, supposedly answered the call. Rurik established his authority in the northern city of This was the beginning of the Rurikid dynasty, a dynasty that would rule the lands of the Rus for over 700 years, shaping its politics, culture, and very identity. Rurik was the founder, but it was his successor who would truly unite the northern and southern lands into a single, powerful state. After Rurik's death, his kinsman, Oleg, took over as a regent for Rurik's young son, Igor. Oleg was a man of ambition and military genius. He wasn't content to rule from the forests of the north. His eyes were set on the prize to the south, the wealthy and strategic city of Kiev, situated on the high banks of the Dnieper River. Kiev was at the heart of the Slavic lands and a crucial hub on the trade route to Constantinople. Around 882, Oleg led his army south. According to the chronicle, he captured Kiev through a mix of trickery and force, killing the two local Varangian warlords who ruled there. Standing on the hills overlooking the Dnieper, Oleg declared Kiev the mother of all Rus cities. This was the pivotal moment. By capturing Kiev, Oleg united the two major centers of Varangian and Slavic power, Novgorod in the north and Kiev in the south. This new political entity, a vast territory stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, controlled by a Varangian elite ruling over a predominantly Slavic population, became known as Kievan Rus. And what about the name? The name Rus. Where did it come from? Its origin is another historical puzzle. The most widely accepted theory is that Rus was the name the Slavs and others used to describe the Varangian newcomers, possibly derived from an Old Norse word for the men who row. Over time, this name for the ruling class was transferred to the state they governed and, eventually, to the people who lived within it. The Varangian elite gradually assimilated, adopting Slavic language, customs, and names. The line between Slav and Varangian blurred. A new identity was being forged in the crucible of these eastern lands. The word Rus would evolve over the centuries into Russia, the name we know today. Russia. So, the birth of Russia wasn't a single event. It was a slow, complex fusion of peoples and cultures. It began with the nomadic echoes of the Scythians on the open steppe. It grew from the roots of Slavic farmers in the deep forests, and it was forged into a state by the swords and longships of Viking warriors searching for fortune. The foundation was laid, a unique blend of Slavic soul and Viking steel. From these dramatic and diverse origins, a new civilization was born, ready to make its mark on the world. Imagine a realm so powerful, so sophisticated, that its capital, Kiev, rivaled the greatest cities in Europe. This is the story of its golden age, its tragic fragmentation, and the storm that swept it all away. So, how did Kievan Rus become such a powerhouse? A pivotal moment came under the rule of Vladimir the Great around the year 988. Vladimir made a decision that would shape the destiny of this land for 1,000 years. He adopted Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantine Empire. This wasn't just a change in religion. It was a profound cultural shift. By embracing Byzantium's faith, Kievan Rus plugged itself into one of the world's most advanced civilizations. It inherited a rich tradition of art, architecture, literature, and law. Grand churches with stunning golden domes began to rise, and the Cyrillic alphabet, adapted for the Slavic languages, opened the door to literacy and learning. This connection to the Greek-speaking world set the Rus on a distinct path, separating them from the Catholic West and embedding them firmly within the Orthodox sphere. This foundation was built upon by Vladimir's son, Yaroslav, known to history as Yaroslav the Wise, and wise he was. Yaroslav's reign in the early 11th century marks the absolute zenith of Kievan Rus. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a builder, a diplomat, and a legislator. He created the first East Slavic law code, the Russkaya Pravda, or Rus justice. This set of laws brought order and a sense of shared legal tradition to the vast and diverse lands under his control. Under Yaroslav, the city of Kiev truly blossomed. It became a metropolis of maybe 50,000 people, enormous for the time. Travelers were awestruck by its hundreds of churches, its bustling markets filled with goods from Constantinople to Scandinavia, and its formidable fortifications. The magnificent St. Sophia Cathedral was built during his reign, a masterpiece meant to rival the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople itself. Yaroslav also used his family as a tool of international diplomacy. He married his daughters to the kings of France, Hungary, and Norway, weaving Kievan Rus into the very fabric of European royalty. For a brief, shining moment, Kiev was not on the periphery of Europe. It was one of its most brilliant centers of power, wealth, and culture. It was a true golden age, but golden ages, by their nature, do not last forever. The strength of Kievan Rus was also its greatest weakness, its system of succession. After Yaroslav the Wise died in 1054, his grand state began to unravel. Instead of the realm passing to a single heir, Yaroslav divided it among his sons, who were supposed to rule in cooperation. In theory, the brothers would move up a ladder of seniority, eventually inheriting the grand prize, the throne of Kiev. In reality, this created a nightmare of endless civil war. Princes, cousins, uncles, and nephews all vied for power. The once united realm fractured into a dozen competing, often warring, principalities. Cities like Chernigov, Polotsk, and Vladimir Suzdal rose to challenge Kiev's dominance. While the land remained culturally connected, it was politically shattered. This constant infighting drained resources, weakened defenses, and left the Rus principalities dangerously exposed. They were so busy fighting each other that they failed to notice the existential threat gathering on the horizon. And then, the storm broke. In the early 13th century, a new and terrifying force erupted from the steppes of Central Asia. The Mongols, led by the heirs of Genghis Khan. The Mongol armies were unlike anything the Rus had ever faced. They were a highly disciplined, mobile, and utterly ruthless military machine. In 1237, the Mongol invasion of Rus began, led by Batu Khan. The timing couldn't have been worse. The fragmented Rus princes, unable and unwilling to unite, were picked off one by one. The city of Ryazan was the first to fall. The Mongols demanded a tenth of everything, and when the city refused, it was annihilated. Its entire population was put to the sword. This set a grim pattern. City after city was besieged, captured, and burned. Suzdal, Vladimir, Chernigov met a similar fate. The climax came in 1240 with the siege of Kiev. The magnificent city, the mother of Rus cities, was now a shadow of its former glory, weakened by decades of infighting. After a brutal assault, the Mongols breached the walls. The destruction was almost total. A papal envoy passing through a few years later reported seeing countless skulls and bones littering the fields, and found only 200 houses standing in what was once a grand metropolis. The Golden Age was over, buried under ash and ruin. The Mongol conquest was a cataclysm that fundamentally altered the course of history for the Eastern Slavs. For the next 240 years, the Rus princes would be vassals, forced to travel to the Mongol capital of Sarai to pay tribute and receive permission to rule. This period is known as the Mongol Yoke. Yet, amidst this widespread devastation, one major city-state managed to survive relatively unscathed: the Northern Republic of Novgorod. By being pragmatic, seeing the writing on the wall, the leaders of Novgorod chose to submit to the Mongols without a fight. They accepted the status of vassals and agreed to pay the heavy tribute. This decision, while humiliating, saved their city from the destruction that befell Kiev and so many others. Because of this, Novgorod was able to preserve its unique political structure, its thriving trade networks, and its cultural heritage. It became a vital repository of Rus culture and identity during a time of immense turmoil. But Novgorod's challenges weren't just from the east. While the rest of Rus was reeling from the Mongol invasion, Western powers saw an opportunity. Swedish armies and the formidable German crusaders, the Teutonic Knights, pushed eastward, hoping to conquer territory and convert the Orthodox population to Catholicism. This is where one of Russia's most iconic heroes enters the stage. Prince Alexander of North. In 1240, the same year, Kiev fell. Alexander defeated a Swedish army on the banks of the Neva River, earning him the famous title Nevsky. But his most legendary victory came 2 years later, in 1242. Alexander led his Novgorodian forces against the heavily armored Teutonic Knights. He lured them onto the frozen surface of Lake Papoose. During the fierce fighting, the ice cracked under the weight of the knights' heavy armor, and many of them drowned. This dramatic victory, known as the Battle on the Ice, halted the western advance and secured Novgorod's independence. Alexander Nevsky became a national symbol, a defender of the land and the Orthodox faith. He was a shrewd leader who understood he had to fight the West while appeasing the East, a delicate balancing act that ensured his people's survival. So, what have we seen? We've watched Kievan Rus rise to become one of Europe's most brilliant civilizations, only to crumble from within due to political fragmentation. This internal weakness left it fatally vulnerable to the Mongol storm, which shattered the old order and ushered in centuries of foreign domination. Yet, even in this dark period, heroes like Alexander Nevsky emerged, and centers like Novgorod kept the flame of Rus culture alive. The Mongol yoke would profoundly reshape the political landscape, paving the way for a new center of power to eventually rise from the ashes. Imagine the Rus lands, once a collection of proud and independent principalities, now under the thumb of a vast and powerful empire. The Golden Horde. For over 2 centuries, the descendants of Genghis Khan ruled from their capital at Sarai on the Volga River. Their control was absolute. Rus princes had to travel to the Horde's court, bow before the Khan, and pay homage to secure their right to rule. The most important prize was the Yarlik, or patent, for the title of Grand Prince of Vladimir. This gave them seniority over other princes and, crucially, the authority to collect the Horde's tribute from all the Rus lands. This system was brutal, but effective. The Mongols weren't interested in micromanaging daily life or religion. They wanted one thing: tribute. Any prince who fell out of line or any city that rebelled would face a devastating punitive expedition. The memory of what happened to Kiev served as a constant, chilling reminder. So, the Rus princes played a dangerous game. They scammed, betrayed, and competed with each other, not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power at Sarai, vying for the Khan's favor. In this landscape of submission and intrigue, a small, seemingly insignificant town began its quiet ascent. This was Moscow, founded by Daniel, the youngest son of the celebrated Alexander Nevsky. The Grand Principality of Moscow was just one of many small domains. It had no glorious history like Kiev or Novgorod. So, how did it become the center of the Russian world? First, geography. Moscow was situated at the crossroads of several major river trade routes, giving it a solid economic foundation. More importantly, it was nestled deep within forests, relatively sheltered from the direct raids of the Horde and other nomadic groups. While other principalities were being ravaged, Moscow became a safe haven, attracting people, wealth, and talent. Second, shrewd politics. Moscow's early princes were masters of pragmatism. They didn't lead heroic, doomed rebellions. Instead, they cultivated a special relationship with the Horde. They were impeccably loyal, paid their tribute on time, and used the Horde's power to weaken their rivals, like the powerful principalities of Tver and Riaz. Prince Ivan Kalita, whose nickname means money bag, was particularly adept at this. He became the primary tax collector for the Mongols, which not only enriched Moscow, but also gave him immense leverage over other Rus princes. He also convinced the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Metropolitan, to move his seat from Vladimir to Moscow. This was a massive coup. Moscow now wasn't just the political and economic center. It was the spiritual heart of the Rus lands. For generations, this strategy of cautious cooperation continued. Moscow grew, absorbing surrounding lands through purchase, diplomacy, and marriage. But as Moscow's strength increased, its relationship with the Horde was destined to change. The turning point came with Ivan Kalita's great-grandson, Prince Dmitry. By the late 14th century, The Golden Horde itself was beginning to fracture due to internal power struggles. Sensing an opportunity, Dmitry decided to challenge the Horde's authority directly. In 1380, he gathered a massive, unified Rus army and met the forces of the Tatar commander Mamai at Kulikovo Field, near the Don River. The Battle of Kulikovo was immense and bloody. According to chronicles, the fields ran red and the Don River was choked with bodies for days. In the end, Dmitry's forces won a stunning victory. He returned to Moscow hailed as Dmitry Donskoy, or Dmitry of the Don. Now, let's be clear. This battle did not end Mongol rule. In fact, just 2 years later, a new Khan Toktamish sacked and burned Moscow to reassert the Horde's dominance. The tribute payments resumed, but the psychological impact of Kulikovo was immeasurable. For the first time in over a century, the Rus had met the Horde in an open field and won. It proved that the Tatars were not invincible. A sense of unity and shared identity, forged in the heat of that battle, began to spread across the principalities. The idea of a unified Russian land was being reborn, with Moscow at its head. The final act of this long drama came a century later under Ivan III, a figure so important he is known as Ivan the Great. By his time, the Golden Horde had shattered into several smaller, competing khanates, like those of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Crimea. The balance of power had decisively shifted. Ivan III continued his predecessor's work of gathering the Russian lands, most notably annexing the vast and wealthy Republic of Novgorod. He consolidated power, created a new legal code, and began rebuilding the Moscow Kremlin with the help of Italian architects, giving it the iconic red brick walls and cathedrals we see today. Another pivotal event happened far to the south. In 1453, the city of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire and the center of Orthodox Christianity for 1,000 years, fell to the Ottoman Turks. This sent shockwaves through the Orthodox world. With the fall of the Second Rome, Russian churchmen and ideologues began to promote a powerful new idea. Moscow was now the Third Rome. It was the last and greatest bastion of true orthodoxy, the heir to the legacy of both Rome and Constantinople. This ideology gave the rulers of Moscow a profound sense of divine mission and destiny. Fueled by this new self-confidence, in 1480, Ivan the Great took the final, decisive step. He renounced all allegiance to the Horde and refused to pay any more tribute. The Khan, at the time, Akhmet, gathered an army and marched on Moscow. The two forces met at the Ugra River, southwest of the city. But instead of a bloody battle, something strange happened. They just stood there, on opposite banks, 4 weeks. Neither side was willing to commit to a full-scale attack. Finally, as winter set in, the Tatar forces simply turned around and went home. This quiet, almost anticlimactic event is known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River. It is traditionally considered the definitive end of the Tatar Yoke. After 240 years, the Rus lands were finally free from Mongol dominion. Ivan's son, Vasily III, continued the work of consolidation, annexing the last few independent principalities like Pskov and Ryazan. By the time of his death, the Grand Principality of Moscow was no longer just the strongest of the Rus states. It was, for all intents and purposes, the only one left. A new, centralized, and powerful state had been forged in the crucible of Mongol domination. The stage was now set for Ivan the Great's grandson, a man who would take the title of Tsar, and whose name would become synonymous with the power and terror of the new Russian state. Ivan the Terrible. This is where Muscovy truly becomes Russia, an empire forged in conquest, paranoia, and blood. In 1547, the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan IV, did something unprecedented. He crowned himself Tsar, a title derived from the Roman Caesar. The message was clear. Moscow was no longer just another principality. It was the heir to Byzantium, the Third Rome, a true empire. And an empire needs to expand. Ivan's early reign was marked by spectacular military success. He turned his attention eastward, to the remnants of the Golden Horde, the Tatar Khanates that had once dominated Russia. In a series of brilliant campaigns, he conquered the Khanate of Kazan, and then the Khanate of This was a monumental victory. For the first time, the entire length of the Volga River, a vital trade artery, was under Russian control. The path to the Caspian Sea and the markets of Persia and Central Asia was now wide open. Russian settlers, merchants, and soldiers began pouring into these new lands. Buoyed by these victories, Ivan turned his gaze west, towards the Baltic Sea. He craved a port that wasn't frozen for half the year, a direct window to the more advanced nations of Western Europe. This ambition sparked the long and draining Livonian War, a 25-year struggle against a powerful coalition, including Sweden and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. While Russia did manage to establish a northern port at Arkhangelsk on the White Sea, it was a consolation prize. The Livonian War was a strategic failure. It bled the treasury dry, cost countless lives, and ultimately ended in a bitter defeat, leaving the state dangerously weakened. And as the external wars drained the country, an internal darkness was consuming its ruler. The promising, reform-minded Tsar of the early years, replaced by a man consumed by paranoia and suspicion. The death of his beloved wife, Anastasia, seemed to be the breaking point. Ivan became convinced he was surrounded by traitors, that the boyars, the old nobility, were plotting against him. To crush his enemies, real or imagined, he created one of history's most terrifying instruments of state terror. He divided Russia into two parts. One part, the Apraknina, was his personal domain, ruled directly by him. The rest was left to the traditional administration. To enforce his will, he unleashed his private army, the dressed in black, riding black horses, and bearing the symbol of a dog as head and a broom to sniff out treason and sweep it away. It became a plague upon the land. They had absolute power to arrest, torture, and execute anyone Ivan deemed an enemy. They descended on cities like Novgorod, a once proud republic, and carried out massacres, slaughtering thousands in a frenzy of violence. This was the terrible in Ivan the Terrible, a reign of terror that traumatized a generation and left deep scars on the Russian psyche. While Ivan terrorized his own people, the empire's external threats hadn't gone away. The state, weakened by the Livonian War and internal chaos, was vulnerable. In 1571, a massive army of Crimean Tatars, vassals of the Ottoman Empire, swept north. They bypassed Russian defenses, reached the capital, and did the unthinkable. They burned Moscow to the ground. The city was a smoldering ruin. It was a national humiliation. But Russia was not broken. The very next year, the Tatars returned, expecting to finish the job and dissolve the Russian state. This time, however, they were met at the Battle of Malady, just south of Moscow. In a desperate and bloody fight, the Russian army, using innovative mobile fortifications, annihilated the Crimean horde. It was one of the most decisive battles in Russian history, a victory that saved the state from total collapse and secured its heartland for good. While the Tsar ruled from the center, a new and volatile force was taking shape on the vast, untamed frontiers of the south and east, the Cossacks. These were communities of free-spirited warriors, runaway serfs, adventurers, and rebels. They lived in semi-independent military brotherhoods along the Don and Dnieper rivers. They were a double-edged sword for the Tsars. On one hand, they were a lawless, rebellious headache. On the other, they were an invaluable buffer, a first line of defense against the Tatars and other nomadic raiders. They were the wild, untamed spirit of the frontier. And it was one of these Cossack leaders who would open the next great chapter of Russian expansion. The wealthy Stroganov merchant family, who had a license from the Tsar to develop the Ural Mountains, hired a Cossack chieftain named Yermak. His mission was to push back against a troublesome local ruler, the Khan of Siberia. Yermak and his small band of heavily armed Cossacks crossed the Urals and entered a vast, unknown world. Against overwhelming odds, they used their firearms and discipline to defeat the armies of the Khanate of Siberia and capture its capital. Yermak himself would eventually be killed, but the door he had kicked open would never be closed. This was the beginning of the Russian conquest of Siberia, a relentless, centuries-long push across a continent that would eventually take Russians all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But back in Moscow, the Tsar's personal tragedy was about to become a national catastrophe. Ivan's paranoia and violent temper, which had cost his country so much, now struck at the heart of his own family. In a fit of uncontrolled rage during an argument, he struck his eldest son and chosen heir, the capable and intelligent Ivan Ivanovich, with his pointed staff. The blow was fatal. The Tsar had murdered his own successor. This act sealed the fate of his dynasty. Ivan's only remaining son, Fyodor, was pious but politically weak and possibly intellectually disabled. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, Fyodor became Tsar. But the real power lay with his ambitious and clever brother-in-law, a boyar named Boris Godunov. Fyodor's reign was a placeholder. He died childless in 1598, and with him, the Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 700 years, came to a sudden, inglorious end. Boris Godunov was elected the new Tsar, but his rule was plagued by questions of legitimacy. The old dynasty was gone. Russia, an empire born of Ivan's will, was now teetering on the brink of a new and terrifying crisis. A period of chaos and civil war that would come to be known as the Time of Troubles. Ivan the Terrible's legacy is a tangle of contradictions. He was a modernizer who expanded the empire, reformed the army, and opened trade with the West. He was also a paranoid tyrant who murdered his own son and unleashed a wave of terror that nearly destroyed his own country. He left behind a Russia that was bigger, stronger, and more imperial than ever before, but also one that was traumatized, fragile, and standing on the precipice of anarchy.
Imagine a country on its knees. Imagine a country on its knees. Its ruler is dead, its people are starving, and civil war is tearing it apart. Foreign armies march through its capital, and impostors claiming to be the rightful heir pop up one after another. This isn't the plot of a fantasy novel. This was Russia at the turn of the 17th century. This was the time of troubles, a period so chaotic it nearly erased Russia from the map. But from these ashes, a new dynasty would rise and rule for 300 years. When Tsar Boris Godunov died in 1605, the fragile stability he had built shattered. The country was already reeling from a terrible famine, one so bad that people resorted to eating grass, and there were even reports of cannibalism. With the throne empty, a power vacuum opened up, and it sucked in everyone with an ambition. The first to exploit the chaos was a man we now call False Dmitry I. He claimed to be Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, Dmitry, who had supposedly died years earlier. With support from Russia's rivals, Poland and Lithuania, he marched on Moscow. The people, desperate for a legitimate ruler and tired of the feuding boyars, or nobles, actually welcomed him. He was crowned Tsar, but his reign was short-lived. His pro-Polish policies and foreign manners quickly alienated the Russian nobility and the Orthodox Church. Less than a year later, the boyars stormed the Kremlin, killed him, and paraded his ashes, fired from a cannon in the direction of Poland. But the story doesn't end there. The idea of a true Tsar Dmitry was too powerful to die. Soon, a second false Dmitry appeared, gathering a massive army of peasants, Cossacks, and disillusioned nobles. He set up a rival court just outside Moscow, leading to a bizarre situation where Russia effectively had two governments, two patriarchs, and two sets of loyalties. The country was split in half. This internal chaos was a golden opportunity for Russia's neighbors. Seeing the weakness, King Sigismund of Poland decided he didn't just want to support a puppet Tsar, he wanted the Russian throne for his own son, or even for himself. Polish forces marched in, and in 1610, they did the unthinkable, they occupied Moscow. The heart of Russia was in foreign hands. At the same time, Sweden, another regional power, saw its chance and seized the major city of Novgorod in the north. Russia was on the verge of being completely carved up and disappearing as an independent state. It was the nation's darkest hour. Just when all hope seemed lost, something incredible happened. The threat of foreign domination and the destruction of their Orthodox faith finally united the Russian people against a common enemy. A call for a national resistance movement echoed from the city of Nizhny Novgorod. Two unlikely heroes stepped forward to lead it, Prince Dmitry Pozharsky, a respected military commander, and Kuzma Minin, a common merchant. Minin delivered a series of passionate speeches, urging his fellow citizens to sacrifice their wealth, their property, even their families, to fund a volunteer army to save the motherland. His words lit a fire. People from all walks of life, from rich merchants to poor artisans, donated what they could. Pozharsky, a skilled general who had been wounded fighting the Poles, was chosen to lead the new army. This national militia, a true people's army, began its long march to Moscow in 1612. They weren't just fighting for a particular czar or a noble faction, they were fighting for the very idea of Russia. After a series of fierce battles, Pozharsky and Minin's army besieged the Polish garrison trapped inside the Kremlin. Starving and with no hope of reinforcement, the Poles finally surrendered. On November 4, 1612, Moscow was liberated. This momentous victory is still celebrated in Russia today as National Unity Day, a symbol of the people coming together to save their nation. With the foreigners expelled from the capital, the next task was to restore order and, most importantly, choose a new, legitimate Tsar. In 1613, a Grand National Assembly, known as the Zemsky Sobor, was convened. It was one of the most representative assemblies in Russian history, with delegates from the clergy, the nobility, townsfolk, and even some state peasants. After much deliberation, they needed a candidate who was acceptable to the powerful feuding boyar clans but not too powerful himself. They needed someone who represented a link to the old dynasty but also a fresh start. Their choice fell upon a quiet, 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov. Why him? Mikhail was the son of a prominent church leader, Patriarch Filaret, and his family was related to Ivan the Terrible's first wife. He was young, seen as pliable, and most importantly, he had been in a monastery during the worst of the fighting, so he hadn't made any powerful enemies. In 1613, Mikhail was elected Tsar, founding the Romanov dynasty, which would guide Russia's destiny for the next 3 centuries, right up until the Revolution of 1917. The first Romanovs inherited a country in ruins. Their primary goal was survival. Mikhail's reign was focused on making peace and buying time. He signed treaties with Sweden and Poland, giving up territory but securing the borders so that the long process of rebuilding could begin. The central government had collapsed, the treasury was empty, and the countryside was devastated. It was a slow, painful recovery. Under Mikhail's son, Tsar Alexei, the state began to reassert its power and formalize its structure. One of the most significant and tragic developments of his reign was the introduction of a new law code in 1649, the Sobornoye Lazany. This code had a profound impact on Russian society for centuries to come. It officially and legally bound the peasants to the land they worked. They became serfs, essentially the property of the landowner. This wasn't just for their lifetime, their children and their children's children would also be serfs. Serfdom, an institution that had been developing for years, was now locked into Russian law, creating a rigid social hierarchy that would cause immense suffering and fuel future rebellions. Tsar Alexei's reign was also marked by a deep religious crisis. The powerful head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Nikon, initiated a series of reforms to bring Russian liturgical practices in line with their Greek originals. These changes might seem minor to us today, things like how to make the sign of the cross, with 2 fingers or 3, but they were seen by many as a betrayal of the true faith. A massive schism occurred. Those who rejected the reforms became known as the Old Believers. They saw themselves as guardians of the pure, ancient Russian faith and viewed Nikon and the official church as heretical. The state responded with brutal persecution. Old Believers were exiled, imprisoned, and even burned at the stake. Despite this, their communities survived, often in remote areas of Siberia, preserving their unique traditions and becoming a persistent, dissenting voice within Russian society. While grappling with internal issues, Russia also began to look outwards again. In the middle of the 17th century, the Cossacks of Ukraine, who had been living under Polish-Lithuanian rule, launched a massive rebellion led by their leader, Bogdan Khmelnytsky. The Cossacks were fierce warriors and fiercely protective of their Orthodox faith and their autonomy. After initial successes, they found themselves struggling against the might of Poland. In 1654, Khmelnytsky appealed to Tsar Alexei, a fellow Orthodox ruler, for protection. Russia agreed, seeing an opportunity to reclaim ancient lands and expand its influence. This triggered a long and bloody war with Poland that lasted for 13 years. By the end, Russia had made significant gains, including the strategic city of Smolensk and, crucially, eastern Ukraine, including the city of Kiev. This marked a major shift in the balance of power in Eastern Europe and began the process of incorporating Ukraine into the Russian sphere. But the Cossacks, who had sought Russian protection, soon found that a new master could be just as demanding as the old one. The increasing centralization of power from Moscow chafed against their traditional freedoms. This tension exploded in one of the largest popular uprisings in Russian history. In 1670, a Don Cossack leader named Stenka Razin led a massive revolt. It started as a pirate expedition on the Caspian Sea but quickly turned into a full-blown social war. He declared he was fighting against the oppressive boyars and corrupt officials, not the Tsar himself. His message resonated with runaway serfs, poor townspeople, and various ethnic minorities along the Volga River. His army swelled, and they captured major cities like Astrakhan and Saratov, threatening the very core of the state. For a moment, it seemed like the time of troubles might be returning. However, the rebellion was ultimately no match for the organized state army. Razin's forces were defeated, and he was captured. He was taken to Moscow in a cage, brutally tortured, and then publicly executed in Red Square in 1671. The rebellion was crushed, but the legend of Stenka Razin lived on in folk songs and stories, a potent symbol of defiance against oppression. From the brink of annihilation during the time of troubles, Russia had been reborn. The Romanov dynasty had survived its first tests, re-established central authority, expanded its borders, and put the country back on its feet. But the solutions they found created new problems. The entrenchment of serfdom created a social time bomb, the religious schism left a deep spiritual wound, and the constant tension between the central state and the freedom-loving periphery would continue to define Russian history. The stage was now set. How does a country stuck in the past suddenly become a major European power? The answer lies with one man, a giant, both literally and figuratively, named Peter the Great. This is the story of how one ruler dragged Russia, kicking and screaming, into the modern age. Our story begins in late 17th century Russia, a vast and isolated land. While Western Europe was experiencing the Enlightenment and scientific revolutions, Russia was still deeply rooted in medieval traditions. But change was on the horizon, embodied by the young Tsar Peter. After a turbulent childhood and a power struggle with his ambitious half-sister Sophia, Peter finally seized full control of the throne. And he wasn't your typical ruler. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, he was a man of boundless energy, insatiable curiosity, and a will of iron. He saw that Russia was falling behind, and he was determined to change that, no matter the cost. So what does a Tsar do when he wants to learn? He goes back to school. In an unprecedented move, Peter embarked on what became known as the Grand Embassy. He traveled across Western Europe, not as a Tsar in lavish palaces, but incognito, working as a common shipwright in the shipyards of Holland and England. He wanted to learn with his own hands. He studied shipbuilding, military tactics, city planning, and every kind of modern technology he could find. He wasn't just observing, he was absorbing the very essence of the West. When Peter returned to Russia, he was a man on a mission, and the culture shock was immediate. He brought with him a team of European experts and a vision for a new Russia. He declared war on old customs. The long beards and flowing robes of the Russian nobility, the boyars, were the first to go. Peter, sometimes personally, would take a razor to his courtiers' beards, a deeply symbolic act. He decreed that everyone at court must wear Western-style clothing. It was a clear message: the old ways are over. But these were just superficial changes. Peter's real reforms cut much deeper. He reorganized the entire structure of the Russian government, creating a more efficient, centralized bureaucracy modeled on Western systems. He established the table of ranks, a system where social status was based on service to the state, not on birthright. This meant even a commoner could rise to nobility through merit, a revolutionary idea for Russia. His military reforms were even more transformative. He understood that to be a great power, Russia needed a modern army and, more importantly, a navy. Russia had no navy. Peter built one from scratch. He introduced conscription, created new military schools, and equipped his soldiers with modern firearms and tactics. The old, unruly palace guard, the Streltsy, who had rebelled against him, were brutally crushed and disbanded. In their place rose a professional, disciplined fighting force loyal to the Tsar alone. Peter knew that all this modernization would be meaningless without access to the sea, a window to Europe, for trade and naval power. The problem was, the Baltic Sea was controlled by the dominant power of the north, the Swedish Empire, led by its brilliant and fearsome boy king, Charles XII. And so began the Great Northern War, a conflict that would last for over 2 decades and define Peter's reign. The war started disastrously for Russia. At the Battle of Narva, Charles's small but highly professional Swedish army completely annihilated a much larger Russian force. It was a humiliating defeat. Many thought Russia was finished. But they underestimated Peter's resilience. For Peter, Narva was not an end, but a lesson. He famously said, "The Swedes will teach us how to beat them." He spent the next several years rebuilding his army, recasting church bells into cannons, and learning from his mistakes. He drew the Swedes deeper and deeper into the vast Russian territory, stretching their supply lines, using the harsh Russian winter as an ally. The turning point came in 1709 at the Battle of Poltava. This time, it was Peter's reformed army that was ready. They crushed the exhausted and outnumbered Swedes. Charles XII was forced to flee, and the myth of Swedish invincibility was shattered. Poltava was more than a military victory, it was a statement. Russia had arrived on the European stage. Even before the war was won, Peter had already begun his most audacious project. On a desolate, swampy marshland on the coast of the Baltic, a territory recently captured from Sweden, he decided to build a new capital. This was to be St. Petersburg. It was a monumental undertaking, built on bones. Tens of thousands of serfs and laborers perished in the harsh conditions, draining the swamps and laying the foundations. But Peter's will was absolute. He forced nobles, merchants, and artisans to move there, creating a magnificent city of canals and palaces in the European style, a stark contrast to old, Asiatic Moscow. St. Petersburg was his window to Europe, a symbol of the new Russia he was forging. The Great Northern War finally ended in 1721 with the Treaty of Nystad. The treaty confirmed Russia's control over a vast stretch of the Baltic coastline, including modern-day Estonia and Latvia. Sweden's time as a great power was over, and Russia's had just begun. The European balance of power was forever changed. In recognition of his monumental achievements, the Russian Senate bestowed upon Peter new titles: Peter the Great, Father of the Fatherland, and Emperor of all Russia. He had transformed a backward kingdom into a formidable empire. Peter's legacy is complex and controversial. He was a visionary and a reformer, but also a ruthless tyrant. His modernization was brutal, imposed from the top down with an iron fist, and built on the suffering of countless ordinary Russians. He widened the cultural gap between the westernized elite and the traditionalist masses. Yet, there is no denying his impact. He fundamentally altered the course of Russian history, setting it on a path to becoming a global power that would shape world events for centuries to come. He found Russia in wood and left it in stone, forever changing its face and its destiny. After Peter the Great's death, you might think Russia's momentum would stall. But what followed was a dizzying era of palace coups, short-lived rulers, and surprisingly, massive expansion. It's a story that proves the Russian machine, once set in motion, was hard to stop. Peter's death in 1725 left a power vacuum. He hadn't officially named an heir, which was like throwing a match into a powder keg. His wife, a former peasant girl from Lithuania, became Empress Catherine I. But her reign was short, lasting only 2 years. She was succeeded by Peter the Great's grandson, Peter II, who was just a boy. He didn't last long either, dying of smallpox at the age of 14. This chaotic succession set the stage for one of the strangest decades in Russian history. Next up was Anna Ivanovna, Peter the Great's niece. She was brought to the throne by a group of powerful nobles who thought they could control her. They made her sign a set of conditions that severely limited her power. But Anna was craftier than they gave her credit for. Once in power, she literally tore up the document and re-established absolute autocracy. Anna's reign, lasting a decade, is often called the Byronovshchina, named after her German favorite, Ernst Johann von Byron. Her court became infamous for its over-the-top extravagance and cruelty. Think ice palaces built for bizarre mock weddings and court jesters from noble families forced to perform humiliating acts. It was a dark, decadent time, and Byron's influence made him one of the most hated men in Russia. But here's the paradox: while the court in St. Petersburg was drowning in luxury and intrigue, the empire itself was pushing its boundaries further than ever. During Anna's reign, a Danish explorer in Russian service named Vitus Bering was leading one of the most ambitious expeditions in history. Sailing from the Siberian coast, he charted the sea that would one day bear his name, the Bering Strait. He was the first European to definitively prove that Asia and North America were separate continents. Bering's expeditions didn't stop there. He went on to explore the coast of what we now call Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, claiming these vast territories for the Russian Empire. Imagine that, while nobles were plotting in gilded ballrooms, Russian pioneers were landing on a new continent, laying the groundwork for Russian America. It's a stark contrast that shows how the state's expansion had its own powerful, unstoppable logic, separate from the chaos at the very top. When Anna died, the throne passed to her infant grandnephew, Ivan VI. He was just a few months old. His mother, Anna Leopoldovna, acted as regent, but her rule was weak and unpopular. This instability was the perfect opportunity for another claimant to the throne, someone with a much more powerful connection to the Romanov dynasty's legacy. Enter Elizabeth, the daughter of Peter the Great himself. She was beautiful, charismatic, and deeply Russian, unlike the German-dominated court of Anna. In 1741, with the backing of the Imperial Guards, the same guards who had put Catherine I on the throne, Elizabeth staged a bloodless coup. She marched to the Winter Palace, woke the infant Ivan and his parents, and declared herself the new empress. But what happened to the baby Tsar, Ivan VI? His fate is one of Russia's great tragedies. To prevent any future claims to the throne, Elizabeth had him imprisoned. He spent his entire life locked away, moved from one fortress to another, his identity a state secret. He grew up in total isolation, with no human contact except for his jailers. Years later, during the reign of Catherine the Great, a misguided officer attempted to free him. The rescue failed, and following strict standing orders, Ivan's guards killed him. He was 23 years old and had spent over 20 of those years as a prisoner. Empress Elizabeth, however, ushered in a new era. She was her father's daughter in ambition, if not in work ethic. She loved parties, balls, and fashion, but she also had a sharp political mind. Her reign saw a flowering of the arts and sciences. She founded the University of Moscow and the Imperial Academy of Arts. Russia was becoming a true European cultural power. And speaking of Europe, Elizabeth wasn't afraid to flex Russia's military muscle. She plunged Russia into the 7 Years' War, a massive conflict that was essentially the First World War. She allied with France and Austria against the brilliant military genius, Frederick the Great of Prussia. The Russian army proved formidable. They crushed Frederick's forces at the Battle of Kunersdorf and even managed to occupy his capital, Berlin. By 1761, Frederick was on the brink of total defeat. He was cornered, his armies were shattered, and he was contemplating suicide. Russia was poised to become the dominant power in Central Europe. And then, in a moment that changed history, Empress Elizabeth died. Her successor was her nephew, Peter III. He was a deeply eccentric character who, bizarrely, idolized Frederick the Great. One of his first acts as emperor was to pull Russia out of the war, switch sides, and give back all the territory the Russian army had fought and died to conquer. It was an astonishing turn of events, known in Prussia as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, and it saved Frederick from certain doom. But let's go back to Elizabeth for a moment. Her legacy isn't just military or political. It's also architectural. It was during her reign that the magnificent Winter Palace in St. Petersburg was completed. Designed by the Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli, it's a breathtaking masterpiece of Baroque style, with over 1,000 rooms, gilded halls, and an opulent facade stretching along the Neva River. This palace wasn't just a home for the Tsars, it became the ultimate symbol of the autocracy's power and wealth. And it's deeply ironic that this very building, a testament to the might of the Romanov dynasty, would later become the focal point of its destruction. In 1917, the storming of the Winter Palace would signal the end of the empire and the beginning of the Russian Revolution. So, the decades after Peter the Great were a whirlwind of short reigns, brutal court politics, and palace coups. Yet, through it all, the empire continued its relentless eastward march to the Pacific, and its military and cultural influence in Europe grew stronger. It was an era of contradiction, of decadence and discovery, of tragedy and triumph. And it set the stage for another larger-than-life ruler, a German princess who would seize the throne and redefine Russia all over again, Catherine the Great. After Peter the Great, Russia's throne saw a series of less-than-stellar rulers. But the stage was set for someone truly extraordinary to take power. And she arrived not through a peaceful succession, but through a dramatic palace coup. This is the story of Catherine the Great, the woman who would guide Russia to its imperial zenith in the 18th century. It all started with her husband, Peter III. He was deeply unpopular, not least because of his obsession with Prussia, Russia's recent enemy. He alienated the court, the church, and the military. So, in 1762, his German-born wife, Catherine, led a coup with the help of the imperial guards. Just days later, Peter died under mysterious circumstances, and Catherine was left as the sole, undisputed ruler of the Russian Empire. Catherine was a fascinating and complex figure. She is often called an enlightened despot, a new type of monarch for the age of reason. She was highly intelligent, a voracious reader, and famously corresponded with the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, like Voltaire and Diderot. She saw herself as a philosopher on the throne, dedicated to modernizing Russia not just with armies, but with ideas. And she put her money where her mouth was. Catherine became a massive patron of the arts and sciences. She founded the Smolny Institute, one of the first state-financed schools for girls in Europe. She established new academies and libraries. She even founded theaters, including the one that would become the world-famous Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. Her personal passion was collecting art. She bought entire collections from across Europe, and this massive trove of masterpieces would form the foundation of one of the greatest museums in the world, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. To develop her vast empire, Catherine knew she needed more people and more expertise. She actively invited foreign specialists, engineers, and artisans to Russia. Most famously, she issued a manifesto inviting foreigners to settle in Russia, promising them land, tax exemptions, and religious freedom. This led to a huge wave of German immigration, with many establishing colonies along the Volga River, becoming known as the Volga Germans. They would transform the agriculture of the region and remain a distinct community for centuries. But Catherine was no mere philosopher queen. She was also a ruthless and brilliant strategist who understood that imperial power rested on military might. Her reign was marked by a series of stunning military victories that dramatically expanded Russia's borders and influence. Her primary target was the Ottoman Empire to the south. In two major wars, Russian armies and navies decisively defeated the Ottomans. The treaties that followed were a massive win for Russia. They gained crucial ports and fortresses on the Black Sea, like Azov and Kerch, and secured the right for their merchant ships to pass through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. This fulfilled a long-held Russian dream of securing a warm water outlet to the world's oceans. While expanding her empire abroad, Catherine faced a massive threat at home. From 1773 to 1775, a huge rebellion erupted, led by a Don Cossack named Yemelian Pugachev. Pugachev claimed he was the miraculously surviving Tsar Peter III, Catherine's dead husband. He promised to end serfdom and grant freedom to the peasants and Cossacks. The revolt spread like wildfire across the Ural and Volga regions, becoming the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. It was incredibly brutal on both sides. But Catherine's modern army eventually crushed the rebellion. Pugachev was captured, brought to Moscow in a cage, and publicly executed. The Pugachev rebellion had a profound impact on Catherine. It showed her the deep discontent simmering beneath the surface of her empire and hardened her resolve. She saw the Cossack hosts, with their semi-independent traditions, as a source of instability. In the years following the revolt, she moved decisively to bring them under state control. The most famous of these groups, the Zaporozhian Sich in Ukraine, was completely dissolved, its lands absorbed into the empire. With the Ottomans weakened and internal rebellions crushed, Catherine turned her attention to the Black Sea peninsula of Crimea, which had been a vassal state of the Ottoman Sultan for centuries. In 1783, she annexed Crimea outright, a bold and strategic move that solidified Russia's control over the entire northern Black Sea coast. She created a new administrative region for these southern territories, calling it Novorossiya, or New Russia, and poured resources into developing cities like Odessa, Kherson, and Sevastopol, which became the main base for Russia's new Black Sea fleet. But perhaps Catherine's most consequential foreign policy achievement was in the West. At the time, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a large but politically weak state, paralyzed by internal divisions among its nobility. Seeing an opportunity, Russia, Prussia, and Austria conspired to carve it up. Over 3 separate partitions, in 1772, 1793, and 1795, they systematically annexed Polish territory until, after the final partition, the state of Poland was completely erased from the map of Europe. It wouldn't reappear as an independent nation for over 120 years. These partitions brought vast new territories and populations into the Russian Empire, including a significant number of Jews. Previously, Russia had a very small Jewish population. Now, it had one of the largest in the world. Catherine's government, however, did not integrate them into Russian society. Instead, it created the Pale of Settlement, a vast territory in the western part of the empire where Jews were legally required to live. They were forbidden from settling in major cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg and faced numerous legal and economic restrictions. This policy of segregation and discrimination would have long-lasting and tragic consequences for centuries to come. Towards the end of her reign, a world-shaking event occurred that would challenge everything Catherine thought she believed in, the French Revolution. In her early years, she had championed the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment. But when those ideas led to the overthrow of the French monarchy and the execution of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, Catherine was horrified. She saw it as a descent into chaos and mob rule. The revolution soured her on liberal philosophy entirely. She cracked down on dissent at home, censored books she had once admired, and became a staunch opponent of revolutionary France. The enlightened despot had, in her final years, become a deeply conservative autocrat, fearing the very ideas she had once promoted. Catherine the Great died in 1796, leaving behind an empire that was larger, stronger, and more powerful than ever before. She had expanded Russia's borders to the south and west, transformed it into a dominant European power, and presided over a golden age of arts and culture. Yet, she also entrenched the institution of serfdom, crushed dissent, and laid the groundwork for future ethnic and religious conflicts. She was a true product of her time, an enlightened mind with an iron fist, who brought Russia to the peak of its imperial glory.
This is the story of Alexander I, his epic showdown with Napoleon, and Russia's rise as a European superpower. Our story begins with the end of Catherine the Great's reign. Her son, Paul I, took the throne, but his rule was deeply unpopular and cut short by assassination. This dramatic event brought his son, Alexander I, to power in 1801. Alexander was a complex figure full of enlightened ideals, but ruling an autocratic state. He was a man caught between the past and the future. Early in his reign, a brilliant advisor named Mikhail Speransky stepped onto the scene. Speransky was a visionary. He proposed a massive overhaul of the Russian state, a sweeping reform of its administration and legal system, his ultimate goal, to nudge Russia toward something like a constitutional monarchy. With the separation of powers and a state Duma, it was a breathtakingly modern plan for its time, but the powerful nobility, protective of their privileges, pushed back hard. Alexander, wary of upsetting the old guard that had put him on the throne, ultimately shelved the most radical parts of Speransky's reforms. The dream of a constitution would have to wait. While Alexander wrestled with internal reforms, a storm was gathering in the West. A name that echoed across Europe: Napoleon Bonaparte. The ambitions of the French emperor and the Russian Tsar were destined to collide. Initially, Russia joined the coalitions against France. This led to a series of devastating battles for the Russian army. At Austerlitz in 1805, the combined Russian and Austrian forces were crushed by Napoleon in what's often called his masterpiece. The fighting continued with bloody, indecisive clashes like the Battle of Eylau, followed by another crushing defeat at Friedland in 1807, beaten on the battlefield. Alexander had no choice but to negotiate. The two emperors met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. At Tilsit, this famous meeting led to an uneasy alliance. Russia was forced to join Napoleon's continental system, an economic blockade against Great Britain, which was deeply damaging to Russia's trade. While the alliance held, Russia took the opportunity to expand its borders elsewhere, annexing Finland from Sweden in 1809 after a short war. But the peace with Napoleon was fragile. It was a partnership of rivals, not friends, and both sides knew it. The tension finally snapped in 1812. Convinced that Russia was secretly trading with Britain and seeing Alexander as a rival, Napoleon assembled the largest European army ever seen, the Grande Armée, over 500,000 strong, and launched his fateful invasion of Russia. This was not just a war, it was a clash of civilizations, a test of wills between two emperors. As the massive French army pushed deep into Russian territory, the Russian forces, led by General Barclay de Tolly, employed a scorched earth strategy, retreating and destroying supplies to deny them to the invaders. The French advance was relentless, but it came at a huge cost. Finally, just outside Moscow, the new Russian commander, the old and cunning Mikhail Kutuzov, decided to make a stand. The result was the Battle of Borodino. It was one of the single bloodiest days of the Napoleonic Wars. Tens of thousands of men fell on both sides in a horrific slugging match. Technically, it was a French victory as the Russians withdrew, but the French army was severely weakened. Kutuzov made a momentous decision to abandon Moscow to save the army. As Napoleon entered the ancient capital, he expected a delegation of city elders to offer him the keys. Instead, he found a ghost town, and then the fire started, whether deliberately set by the Russians or an accident. Vast swathes of Moscow burned to the ground, depriving the French of shelter and supplies. Just as winter was approaching, Napoleon waited in the smoldering ruins for weeks, hoping Alexander would surrender. But no message came. The Tsar refused to negotiate. With his army starving and the brutal Russian winter setting in, Napoleon had no choice but to order a retreat. What followed was one of the greatest disasters in military history. The retreat from Moscow was a nightmare of snow, ice, and starvation, harassed constantly by Russian partisans and Cossacks. The once invincible Grande Army disintegrated. Of the more than 500,000 soldiers who invaded, only a tiny, frozen fraction stumbled back across the border. The 1812 campaign had shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility, but Russia wasn't finished. The victory on home soil was just the beginning. In 1813 and 1814, Russian armies marched west, pursuing Napoleon across Europe. They were the backbone of the new coalition that pushed the French back all the way to Paris. In a stunning reversal of fortunes, Tsar Alexander I led his troops into the French capital in March 1814. The man who had been forced into a humiliating alliance at Tilsit was now the arbiter of Europe's destiny. At the Congress of Vienna, the great conference to redraw the map of Europe, Alexander was a central figure. He secured significant gains for Russia, becoming the constitutional king of a newly created Kingdom of Poland, which was tied to the Russian Empire. To safeguard the new conservative order, he initiated the Holy Alliance with Austria and Prussia, a pact to suppress revolutionary movements and uphold Christian principles in governance. Russia had become a key pillar of the European political system, a superpower whose voice could not be ignored. With its western flank secured, Russia also continued its long and difficult expansion southwards, into the Caucasus and the Balkans. This brought it into repeated conflict with the Ottoman Empire and Persia. The push into the mountainous Caucasus region was particularly brutal, meeting fierce and prolonged resistance from local peoples like the Circassians and Chechens. This long, grueling struggle would shape the region for generations to come. Alexander I's reign, which began in the shadow of his father's murder, ended with Russia at the zenith of its power and influence. by facing down the greatest military genius of the age. Russia had not only saved itself, but had also become a dominant force in Europe. The Patriotic War of 1812 left an indelible mark on the Russian national identity, a story of sacrifice and resilience that is told to this day. It's a story about a powerful empire trying to hold back the tides of change, a story that culminates in a disastrous war that would expose its deepest weaknesses. So, let's set the scene. It's December 1825 in St. Petersburg. The previous Tsar, Alexander I, has just died, and there's confusion over who will take the throne. Seizing this moment of uncertainty, a group of reform-minded military officers, inspired by the liberal ideas they encountered in Western Europe during the Napoleonic Wars, decide to act. They gather about 3,000 soldiers in Zenith Square, refusing to swear allegiance to Nicholas and demanding a constitution. This was the Decembrist revolt, but the rebellion was poorly organized and quickly crushed. Nicholas I, now firmly in power, made a chilling example of the leaders. 5 were executed, and over 100 were exiled to the harsh conditions of Siberia. This brutal crackdown sent a clear message. Challenges to the Tsar's absolute power would not be tolerated. Nicholas I's reign was defined by this reactionary spirit. He wasn't interested in the Western European models of liberalism or constitutional monarchy. Instead, his official state ideology was summed up in 3 words: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Let's break that down. Orthodoxy meant the Russian Orthodox Church was the bedrock of society and the state. Autocracy meant the Tsar had unlimited, absolute power given to him by God. And nationality, or narodnost, promoted a distinct Russian national identity, separate from and often superior to the West. This was a powerful cocktail of religious faith, absolute monarchy, and nationalism designed to insulate Russia from the revolutionary ideas sweeping across Europe. Nicholas saw himself as the gendarme of Europe, the policeman ready to stamp out revolution wherever it appeared, and he acted on this belief. When the revolutions of 1848 broke out across Europe, Russia was one of the few major powers left untouched. Nicholas even went a step further. When the Hungarians rose up against Austrian rule, seeking their own independent nation, who came to Austria's rescue? Nicholas I. He sent over 100,000 Russian troops to crush the Hungarian Revolution, restoring Habsburg authority. To the conservatives of Europe, Nicholas was a hero, a defender of the legitimate order. But Russian foreign policy wasn't always so straightforwardly conservative. It could also be opportunistic. While Nicholas was busy suppressing liberal nationalists in Hungary, he actively supported other national movements when it served Russian interests. A prime example is the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. Here, Russia saw a chance to weaken its old rival, the Ottomans, and to expand its influence in the Balkans by posing as the protector of Orthodox Christians. So, Russia, alongside Britain and France, helped the Greeks win their freedom. This shows the complex nature of Nicholas's rule. He was an enemy of revolution, unless that revolution could benefit Russia. This brings us to the core conflict of the era, the growing tensions with the Ottoman Empire. Often called the sick man of Europe, Russia had long dreamed of controlling Constantinople, the historic heart of the Orthodox world, and gaining unrestricted access from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. As the Ottoman Empire weakened, Nicholas saw his chance. He began making aggressive moves, demanding special rights to protect the Orthodox Christians living under Ottoman rule. This was a classic pretext for intervention. These Russian ambitions deeply alarmed the other great powers, particularly Britain and France. Britain was worried about its trade routes to India and saw a strong Russia in the Mediterranean. As a direct threat, France, under Napoleon III, was eager to reassert itself on the European stage and saw a conflict with Russia as a way to do it. The stage was set for a major confrontation. The spark came in 1853 when Russia, frustrated with the Ottomans, destroyed their fleet at the Battle of Sinope in the Black Sea. This decisive Russian victory was the last straw for London and Paris. They declared war on Russia, and the conflict soon focused on the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean War is often remembered for a few famous things: Florence Nightingale and the birth of modern nursing, the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade, and the introduction of new technologies like the telegraph and war photography. But for Russia, it was a brutal awakening. The main objective for the British and French allies was to capture the heavily fortified Russian naval base of Sevastopol in Crimea. They laid siege to the city, and for nearly a year, a bitter and bloody struggle ensued. Russian soldiers and sailors fought with incredible bravery and endurance, holding out against a technologically superior enemy. They faced shelling, disease, and freezing winters. Leo Tolstoy, who served as a young artillery officer in the siege, captured the grim reality and heroism of the defense in his Sevastopol sketches. He described the constant bombardment, the makeshift hospitals filled with the wounded, and the sheer grit of the ordinary Russian soldier. Despite their courage, it was a losing battle. The Allies' steam-powered ships, rifled muskets, and efficient supply lines gave them a decisive edge. In September 1855, after a final, massive assault, Sevastopol fell. The loss of this fortress was a devastating blow to Russian prestige and military power. With Sevastopol gone and the country exhausted, Russia had to sue for peace. The Treaty of Paris in 1856 was a humiliation. Russia was forced to accept the neutralization of the Black Sea, meaning it couldn't maintain a large navy or build coastal fortifications there. This effectively ended its ambitions of dominating the region and threatening Constantinople. The war was over, and Russia had been defeated on its own doorstep by the Western powers. The impact of the Crimean War on Russia was profound. It was a shocking reality check. The war mercilessly exposed just how far Russia had fallen behind Western Europe. The country's infrastructure was abysmal. It took months to move troops and supplies from the heartland to Crimea because there were barely any railways. The Russian army, while massive and brave, was equipped with outdated smooth-bore muskets, while the British and French had more accurate rifles. The industrial gap was massive. While Britain was the workshop of the world, Russia was still a largely agrarian, feudal society based on serfdom. The very system Nicholas I had built to preserve Russia's strength and stability orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality was now revealed as a source of weakness. The rigid autocracy had stifled innovation. The reliance on serfdom had crippled economic development, and the quest for military glory had led to a national disaster. Nicholas I actually died in 1855, before the war's final conclusion, reportedly heartbroken by the defeats. The Crimean War shattered the myth of Russian invincibility and proved that a nation could not be a first-rate military power without a modern economy and society to back it up. This humiliating defeat set the stage for a new era in Russian history. The need for change was no longer a matter of debate for a few liberal officers. It was a matter of national survival. Nicholas's successor, Alexander II, would inherit a beaten and backward country, and he knew that drastic measures were needed. The failure in Crimea would directly lead to the great reforms, most notably the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. The iron-fisted conservatism of Nicholas I had failed, and the shock of the Crimean War forced Russia onto a new, uncertain path of modernization. Ever felt like you're taking one step forward and 2 steps back? That's the story of Russia in the second half of the 19th century. After a humiliating defeat in the Crimean War, everyone, including the new Tsar, Alexander II, knew something had to change. Russia was falling behind the West, and it was time to play catch-up. So, in 1861, Alexander II did something monumental. He abolished serfdom. Just like that, tens of millions of people who were essentially the property of landowners were declared free. It was a massive, progressive move, earning him the title Tsar Liberator. But here's the catch: freedom wasn't exactly free. The newly liberated serfs were often still tied to their village communes, and they were saddled with redemption payments to compensate their former owners. For many, it felt less like liberation and more like a different kind of bondage. It was a classic half measure, a reform that looked great on paper, but was messy and frustrating in reality. Still, Alexander II wasn't done. He introduced local councils called zemstvos. These were elected bodies given control over things like schools, roads, and public health. For the first time, ordinary Russians had a small taste of self-governance. It was a crack of light in the dark fortress of autocracy, and while Alexander was busy reforming at home, he was also expanding Russia's borders with an iron fist. In the Far East, Russia pressured a weakened King China to hand over a huge chunk of territory. On this new land, Russia founded a port city with a name that screamed ambition, Vladivostok, meaning ruler of the East. This gave Russia a major strategic foothold on the Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, in the Caucasus, decades of brutal warfare finally came to an end. Fierce resistance from mountain peoples led by figures like Imam Shamil was crushed, and the entire region was brought under firm Russian control. Further south, in Central Asia, Russian armies swept through ancient khanates like Bukhara and Khiva. This relentless push brought Russia eyeball to eyeball with the British Empire, which was expanding its influence north from India. This rivalry for control of Central Asia became known as the Great Game, a shadowy conflict of spies, diplomacy, and proxy wars fought over the rugged terrain of Afghanistan. But not all expansion was about conquest. In a move that seems unbelievable today, Russia decided to sell a massive piece of its territory. In 1867, it sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million. At the time, many Americans called it Seward's folly, thinking it was a worthless frozen wasteland. Little did they know they just bought a land rich in gold, oil, and other resources. For Russia, it was a way to get some quick cash and offload a territory that was difficult and expensive to defend. This period wasn't just about war and politics. It was a cultural golden age. Russian literature and music exploded onto the world stage. This is the era of Leo Tolstoy writing War and Peace, and Anna Karenina, of Fyodor Dostoevsky grappling with the human soul in crime and punishment. It was the time of composers like Tchaikovsky, whose symphonies and ballets like Swan Lake would become timeless classics. Russia was producing art that was as powerful and complex as the country itself, but the specter of war was never far away. Russia saw itself as the protector of the Slavic peoples in the Balkans, who were still living under Ottoman Turkish rule. In 1877, Russia went to war with the Ottoman Empire, and its armies marched through the Balkans, pushing all the way to the outskirts of Constantinople. Victory seemed total, but the other great powers of Europe, especially Britain and Austria-Hungary, were terrified of Russia getting too powerful. They called for a conference, the Congress of Berlin, where Russia was forced to give back many of its gains. While some Balkan nations like Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro did gain full independence and Bulgaria gained autonomy, it was a bitter diplomatic defeat for Russia. They had won the war, but felt like they lost the peace. And this is where the story takes a dark turn. The half-hearted reforms, the frustrations of the intelligentsia, and the feeling that the Tsar wasn't going far enough created a perfect storm for radicalism. Groups emerged who believed that only violence could bring about real change. They saw the Tsar not as a liberator, but as the ultimate symbol of oppression. A group called People's Will began a campaign of terrorism, hunting the Tsar himself. They tried to blow up his train. They set off a bomb in the Winter Palace. But Alexander II kept surviving, until one day in March 1881, as his carriage drove through the streets of St. Petersburg, a bomb was thrown. It exploded, but the Tsar was unharmed. He got out to check on the wounded, and that's when a second assassin threw another bomb right at his feet. The Tsar Liberator was assassinated by the very people he had tried, in his own way, to help. The reaction was swift and brutal. Alexander II's son, Alexander III, came to the throne. He was a giant of a man, physically imposing and politically reactionary. He had witnessed his father's murder, and it convinced him of one thing: reform was a mistake. It was weakness. The only way to rule Russia was with an iron fist. Alexander III immediately set about reversing his father's reforms. He cracked down on the Zemstvos, increased censorship, and gave more power to the state. He expanded the secret police, the dreaded Okhrana, creating a surveillance state that hunted down revolutionaries with ruthless efficiency. The brief spring of liberalization was over. A harsh political winter had begun. This crackdown also had a vicious, nationalistic edge. Alexander III pursued a policy of Russification, forcing minority groups within the empire, Poles, Finns, Ukrainians, to adopt the Russian language and culture. This policy was particularly brutal for Russia's Jewish population. The government officially sanctioned and even encouraged violent mob attacks against Jewish communities, known as pogroms. Entire villages were destroyed, people were murdered, and a climate of terror was created. Faced with this persecution, millions of Jews fled Russia, with a huge number emigrating to the United States, forever changing the demographic landscape of both countries. In foreign policy, the world was shifting. The newly unified and powerful Germany was seen as a major threat. In a stunning reversal of alliances, autocratic Russia found a new best friend: democratic, Republican France. It was an alliance of convenience, driven by a mutual fear of Germany. French bankers, in turn, saw Russia as a land of opportunity. Under Alexander III's finance minister, Sergei Witt, a massive program of industrialization began, funded heavily by French loans. Witt understood that military power depended on industrial might. He poured money into factories, mines, and especially railways. The crown jewel of this effort was the Trans-Siberian Railway. an audacious project to build a railroad line stretching over 9,000 kilometers across the vast, frozen expanse of Siberia, connecting Moscow in the west with Vladivostok in the east. It was an engineering marvel, a steel spine that would tie the massive empire together and was intended to project Russian power into Asia. So, by the end of the 19th century, Russia was a land of contradictions. It was rapidly industrializing, but remained politically frozen in an autocratic past. It was building a modern economy with foreign money while violently suppressing its own people. Alexander III's policy of reaction and repression seemed to work in the short term. He crushed the revolutionary movement and died peacefully in his bed. But the problems hadn't gone away. They were just simmering beneath the surface, pushed down by the immense pressure of the state. The seeds of revolution, planted during the frustrating reforms of Alexander II and nurtured by the brutal repression of Alexander III, were getting ready to sprout. The stage was being set for the cataclysmic events of the 20th century. We're at the turn of the 20th century, and the Russian Empire, sprawling across a sixth of the world's landmass, is at its absolute peak of territorial expansion. But beneath the surface, the cracks are beginning to show, and they will soon shatter the entire structure. This is the story of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, the Great War, and the revolutions that would change the world forever. In 1894, Nicholas II inherited the throne from his formidable father, Alexander III. From the very beginning, his reign was marked by tragedy. During his coronation festivities in Moscow, a crowd surge at Kodinka Field led to a horrifying stampede, killing over 1,000 people. It was a dark omen for the reign to come. On the world stage, Russia was still flexing its muscles. It expanded its influence deep into Manchuria in northeastern China, establishing a major naval base at Port Arthur. When the Boxer Rebellion erupted in China, Russian troops were part of the international force that intervened, further cementing their presence in the region. This aggressive expansion put Russia on a direct collision course with another rising power in the east, Japan. Both empires had their eyes on Korea and Manchuria. Tensions boiled over, and in 1904, the Russo-Japanese War began. The world expected a swift Russian victory. Instead, the world watched in shock as Russia suffered one humiliating defeat after another. The most catastrophic blow came at the Battle of Tsushima, where the Japanese Navy annihilated Russia's Baltic Fleet after it had sailed halfway around the world to reach the battle. The defeat was a national disgrace and exposed the deep-seated weaknesses of the Tsarist regime. Back home, the war's failures fueled growing discontent. On a freezing Sunday in January 1905, a priest named Father Gapon led thousands of peaceful workers and their families to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They carried icons and portraits of the Tsar, intending to present a petition for better working conditions and political freedoms. But they were met not by the Tsar, but by soldiers. The troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing hundreds. This massacre became known as Bloody Sunday, and the bloodshed that day washed away the people's centuries-old faith in the Tsar as their benevolent little father. The outrage was immediate and explosive. The 1905 revolution had begun. Strikes paralyzed the country. Peasants seized land, and in a stunning act of defiance, the crew of the battleship Potemkin mutinied in the Black Sea. Facing the complete breakdown of his authority, Nicholas II was forced to make concessions. He issued the October Manifesto, a document promising a constitution, civil liberties, and an elected parliament, the Duma. For a moment, it seemed like Russia was on the path to becoming a constitutional monarchy. But the reality was different. The fundamental laws that served as a constitution still gave the Tsar immense power, including the right to dissolve the Duma at will. Nicholas, a firm believer in autocracy, never truly accepted these limitations on his power. His new prime minister, Kyar Stolipan, pursued a two-pronged strategy. He enacted ambitious land reforms, hoping to create a class of loyal, prosperous peasant landowners who would support the throne. At the same time, he ruthlessly suppressed any opposition, with his military field courts executing thousands. The hangman's noose became grimly known as Stolipan's necktie. But his efforts were cut short in 1911 when he was assassinated in a Kyiv opera house, leaving the empire's political future uncertain once more. While the political landscape was turbulent, Russia's economy was booming. Industry grew at a phenomenal rate in the years before the war. But this progress was overshadowed by a growing scandal at the very heart of the imperial court. A mysterious Siberian peasant and self-proclaimed holy man, Grigory Rasputin, had gained incredible influence over the Empress Alexandra. She believed he was the only one who could heal her son, the heir Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. Rasputin's perceived control over the imperial family, combined with rumors of his debauched behavior, scandalized the aristocracy and eroded what little public trust remained in the monarchy. Then came the summer of 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and the intricate web of European alliances pulled the continent into World War I. Russia mobilized to defend its Slavic ally, Serbia, against Austria-Hungary, setting it against Germany. A wave of patriotism swept the country, briefly uniting the people behind the Tsar. But the initial enthusiasm quickly evaporated in the face of disaster. At the Battle of Tannenberg, the German army encircled and destroyed an entire Russian army. The losses were astronomical. While the Russians did achieve significant victories against the Austro-Hungarians, the war on the Eastern Front became a brutal, grinding stalemate. In 1916, General Brusilov launched a massive offensive that shattered the Austrian lines, one of the most successful breakthroughs of the war. But the cost was staggering. Russia poured its last reserves of trained men and materiel into the effort, and by the end, the army was bled white, incapable of launching another major attack. With the Tsar away at military headquarters, having taken personal command of the army, Empress Alexandra and Rasputin were left effectively in charge back in the capital. The government descended into chaos. Desperate to save the monarchy from Rasputin's influence, a group of aristocrats, including the Tsar's own cousin, murdered him in December 1916. They poisoned him, shot him, and finally dumped his body into a frozen river. But killing the mad monk did nothing to solve the underlying crisis. It was far too late. The winter of 1917 was brutally cold. The war had pushed the country to its breaking point. Food and fuel were scarce in the cities, and inflation was rampant. The people were exhausted, hungry, and angry. In late February, women textile workers in Petrograd, the new, less German-sounding name for St. Petersburg, went on strike, demanding bread. They were soon joined by other workers, and the protests grew. The Tsar ordered the troops to fire on the crowds, just as they had in 1905. But this time, the soldiers, who were mostly peasants and workers in uniform themselves, hesitated. Then, they refused. Regiment after regiment mutinied, turned on their officers, and joined the demonstrators. The police were overwhelmed. Authority in the capital simply vanished. With the heart of his empire in open revolt, and his own generals advising him that the war could not be won without a change in government, Nicholas II finally gave in. He abdicated the throne, first in favor of his son Alexei, and then, realizing the boy couldn't rule alone, in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Mikhail. But Mikhail, seeing the writing on the wall, refused the crown. After 300 years, the Romanov dynasty had fallen. A provisional government, formed by members of the Duma, stepped in to fill the void. But it made a fatal mistake. It chose to keep Russia in the war. This decision doomed it from the start. Meanwhile, a parallel power structure was emerging. All across the country, workers, soldiers, and peasants were forming their own councils or Soviets. The most powerful of these, the Petrograd Soviet, controlled the troops, the railways, and the post office. This created a situation of dual power, with two competing governments vying for control. Into this chaotic scene stepped Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik party, smuggled back into Russia by the Germans, who hoped he would stir up trouble. Lenin arrived with a simple, powerful slogan: peace, land, and bread, and he offered a clear solution: all power to the Soviets. While the provisional government faltered, the Bolsheviks' message resonated with the war-weary masses. By October, the time was ripe. Under the brilliant organization of Leon Trotsky, the Bolsheviks' Red Guards began to move. They systematically seized key points throughout Petrograd: bridges, railway stations, telephone exchanges. It was less of a battle and more of a coordinated takeover. The final act came with the storming of the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was holed up. The ministers were arrested. The Bolsheviks were in power. A new, radical chapter in Russian and world history had begun. From the peak of its power to the depths of revolution, the fall of the Russian Empire was a whirlwind of war, social upheaval, and political failure. It's a stark reminder of how even the mightiest empires can crumble from within.
So the Bolsheviks have just seized power in Petrograd. You might think the story ends there, that the revolution is over. But in reality, the fight for Russia's soul was just beginning. Welcome to the Russian Civil War. A conflict so chaotic and brutal it makes Game of Thrones look like a friendly neighborhood dispute. Imagine this: It's not just one side against another. It's a massive, multi-sided freefall. On one side, you have the Reds, the Bolsheviks, and their newly formed Red Army. Led by the brilliant but ruthless Leon Trotsky, they have a clear goal: hold on to power and build a communist state. But who are they fighting? Well, pretty much everyone else. This chaotic mix is known as the Whites. The White Movement was a strange alliance of sworn enemies. You had hardcore monarchists who wanted the Tsar back, liberals who wanted a Western-style democracy, conservative generals, and even some rival socialists who hated the Bolsheviks. Their only real unifying principle was their shared desire to crush Lenin and his party. Because they were so divided, they could never agree on a single leader or a common vision for Russia's future. And that's not all. As the old Russian Empire crumbled, nationalist movements sprang up everywhere. Ukrainians, Georgians, Finns, Poles, and many others saw their chance to break free and create their own independent nations. These groups, often called the Greens, fought against both the Reds and the Whites, carving out their own territories in the chaos. That wasn't complicated enough. Let's throw in foreign powers. Alarmed by the spread of communism, countries like Britain, France, Japan, and even the United States sent troops to Russia. They landed on different fronts, from the freezing north to the far east. Their goal was supposedly to support the Whites and restart the Eastern Front against Germany, but their involvement was often half-hearted and poorly coordinated. It ended up being more of a nuisance than a decisive factor, but it allowed the Bolsheviks to paint themselves as defenders of Russia against foreign invaders, which was a powerful propaganda tool. So you have the Reds, the Whites, the Greens, and foreign armies all fighting each other across a vast and broken country. It was a war of unparalleled brutality. This wasn't just about front lines and battlefields. It was about survival. To win this war, the Bolsheviks unleashed a policy known as war communism. Think of it as communism on steroids, enforced with an iron fist. The state seized control of everything. All industries were nationalized. Private trade was banned. Most controversially, they implemented forced grain requisitioning. Armed squads of Bolsheviks went into the countryside and took grain from peasants, often leaving them with nothing to eat themselves. The idea was to feed the cities and supply the Red Army, but the result was catastrophic. Peasants, seeing no reason to grow food just to have it stolen, stopped planting crops. This, combined with drought and the disruptions of war, led to a horrific famine that killed millions of people. The countryside erupted in constant peasant rebellions, which the Bolsheviks suppressed with extreme violence. The Cheka, the secret police, unleashed the Red Terror, executing tens of thousands of suspected counter-revolutionaries without trial. It was a dark, desperate time where survival was a daily struggle. Yet despite all the chaos, famine, and rebellion, the Red Army began to win. How? They had several key advantages. First, they controlled the industrial heartland of Russia, including Moscow and Petrograd. This gave them access to railways, factories, and population centers. They could move troops and supplies far more effectively than the scattered White armies. Second, they had unity of command and purpose. While the Whites were a mess of competing generals and ideologies, the Reds had a single, ruthless leadership under Lenin and a disciplined military machine under Trotsky. They were fighting for a clear, albeit radical vision of the future. Third, Trotsky proved to be a genius organizer. He transformed a ragtag militia into the formidable Red Army, recruiting former Tsarist officers to provide expertise and ensuring their loyalty by holding their families hostage. He traveled across the vast fronts in an armored train, personally directing battles and inspiring the troops. Slowly but surely, the Red Army picked off the White armies one by one. General Denikin's forces in the south were pushed back from the brink of capturing Moscow. Admiral Kolchak's government in Siberia collapsed. General Yudench's push on Petrograd failed. By 1921, the main White forces were defeated, and the foreign powers, tired of the costly and unpopular intervention, had mostly gone home. With the major enemies vanquished, the Bolsheviks turned their attention to mopping up the remaining pockets of resistance and consolidating their power. They crushed the last of the peasant uprisings, like the massive Tambov rebellion, and reconquered many of the newly independent nations on their borders. Ukraine, Belarus, and the states of the Caucasus were brought back under Moscow's control, becoming Soviet republics. The war had been won, but at an unimaginable cost. Russia was in ruins. Millions were dead from combat, disease, and starvation. The economy had completely collapsed. The revolutionary dream had been forged in the crucible of a devastating civil war. So what came next? With the fighting finally over, it was time to build a new state from the ashes. In December 1922, a treaty was signed between the Soviet republics of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation. This treaty officially created a new country, a new superpower that would dominate the 20th century, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, or the Soviet Union. Moscow became the new capital of this vast, centralized, single-party state. The hammer and sickle flag flew over the Kremlin. The Russian Civil War was over, but its legacy of violence, control, and radical ideology would shape the Soviet Union and the world for the next 70 years. The first chapter of the communist experiment had come to a close, and the next, even more dramatic chapter was about to begin. This is the era right after the brutal Civil War, where Russia was on its knees, and the Bolsheviks had to figure out how to actually govern this massive, shattered country. What they did next would shape the 20th century. So picture this. The year is 1922. The Red Army has won, but the victory feels hollow. The country is devastated by years of World War I and the Civil War. Famine is rampant, industry is in ruins. And the policy of war communism, where the state seized grain from peasants, had led to massive revolts. The famous Kronstadt Rebellion, where sailors who were once heroes of the revolution turned against the Bolsheviks, was a terrifying wake-up call for Lenin. He realized something had to change, and fast, or they would lose everything. This is where the story gets really interesting. Lenin, a hardcore Marxist, makes a shocking U-turn. He introduces something called the New Economic Policy, or NEP. Now, what was the NEP? In simple terms, it was a strategic retreat from pure communism. Was Lenin saying, okay, maybe we push too hard, too fast. Let's take a step back to move forward. The government stopped seizing all grain from the peasants. Instead, they were taxed a certain amount and were allowed to sell any surplus they had on the open market for a profit. Think about that profit in a communist state. Small-scale private businesses, shops, and restaurants were allowed to open. It was like a little dose of capitalism was injected back into the Soviet economy. And you know what? It worked. The NEP was a lifesaver. Food started reappearing in the cities. The economy began to stabilize and recover. The countryside calmed down. For a few years, there was a sense of relative freedom and prosperity, at least compared to the horrors of the war years. These netmen, the private traders and small entrepreneurs, became a common sight, often flaunting their newfound wealth. It was a strange, contradictory time, a communist government allowing capitalist practices to save itself. But while the economy was getting a little looser, politics were getting tighter, much tighter. The Bolsheviks, now officially the Communist Party, had no intention of sharing power. After the Civil War, they systematically crushed all political opposition. Other socialist parties, like the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries, were outlawed. Their leaders were arrested, exiled, or even executed. Russia was officially becoming a one-party state. There was no room for dissent. And how did they enforce this? It's through the ever-present and ever-feared secret police. You might have heard of the Cheka from our previous episodes. Well, it didn't go away, it just changed its name. First to the GPU, and then the OGPU. Whatever the letters on the door, its job remained the same. To hunt down and eliminate enemies of the revolution, this could mean anyone from former aristocrats and monarchists to rival socialists, priests, or even peasants who resisted government policies. The Red Terror might have officially ended with the Civil War, but the state's apparatus of repression was being perfected and embedded deep into the Soviet system. While all this was happening at home, the Soviet Union was also looking abroad. They founded the Communist International, or Comintern, in Moscow. Its explicit goal was to spread revolution around the globe. They believed that for the Soviet experiment to survive, it needed allies, and the best allies would be new communist states. So, they funded and advised communist parties from Germany to China, trying to spark a worldwide proletarian uprising. It was a dual policy: consolidate a one-party dictatorship at home while actively trying to overthrow governments abroad. This, as you can imagine, made the capitalist world like Britain, France, and the United States extremely nervous. Now, let's turn back to the man at the center of it all, Vladimir Lenin. By 1922, the immense stress of leading a revolution and a civil war had taken a severe toll on his health. He suffered a series of strokes that left him increasingly paralyzed and unable to speak. He could see the direction the party was heading, and he was worried. He was especially concerned about the growing power of one man in particular, Joseph Stalin. Stalin at this point wasn't the most famous Bolshevik leader. Figures like Leon Trotsky, the brilliant organizer of the Red Army, were much more well known. But Stalin held a position that seemed boring but was incredibly powerful: General Secretary of the Communist Party. This meant he controlled appointments. He decided who got which job in the vast party bureaucracy that was now running the country. He quietly filled key positions with people loyal to him. In his final months, a partially paralyzed Lenin tried to warn his comrades about Stalin. In a document that became known as his Last Testament, he criticized all the main leaders but was especially harsh on Stalin. He described Stalin as too rude and said this flaw was intolerable in a general secretary. He explicitly recommended that the party find a way to remove Stalin from his post. But it was too late. Lenin was isolated, his health was failing, and his message was suppressed by the very people he was trying to warn. In January 1924, Vladimir Lenin died. His death created a massive power vacuum. There was no clear successor, no process for choosing a new leader. What followed was a ruthless power struggle within the top ranks of the Communist Party. The main contenders were Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. On the surface, Trotsky seemed like the obvious heir. He was a brilliant intellectual, a powerful orator, and the hero of the Civil War. He argued for permanent revolution, the idea that the USSR should aggressively push for revolutions abroad. Stalin, on the other hand, was the master of the inside game. He was patient, cunning, and underestimated by his rivals. He countered Trotsky's idea with his own theory of socialism in one country. He argued that the USSR should focus on building up its own industrial and military strength first, rather than waiting for a world revolution that might never come. This message was more appealing to many party members who were tired of war and chaos and just wanted to focus on rebuilding their own nation. But the real battle wasn't fought over ideas, it was fought in the corridors of power. Stalin used his position as General Secretary masterfully. He formed alliances with other leaders like Zinoviev and Kamenev, who also feared Trotsky's ambition. Together, they formed a troika to politically isolate Trotsky. They accused him of being arrogant, of not being a true old Bolshevik, since he had only joined the party in 1917, and of deviating from Leninism. Stalin controlled the party congresses, the media, and the flow of information. He ensured that his supporters were promoted and that Trotsky's allies were sidelined, demoted, or sent to remote postings. Trotsky was a brilliant debater, but he was outmaneuvered within the party machine that Stalin had so carefully built. Step by step, Stalin stripped Trotsky of his power. In 1925, he was removed as head of the Red Army. In 1926, he was kicked out of the Politburo, the party's ruling committee. By 1927, he was expelled from the Communist Party altogether. And finally, in 1929, Stalin had him exiled from the Soviet Union. Trotsky would spend the rest of his life on the run, writing critiques of Stalin's regime until he was eventually assassinated by a Soviet agent in Mexico in 1940. With Trotsky and the left opposition defeated, Stalin then turned on his former allies, Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had started to realize the monster they had helped create. He used the same tactics to sideline them. By 1928, Joseph Stalin, the man Lenin had warned against, had effectively become the undisputed dictator of the Soviet Union. The era of the NEP was coming to a close. Stalin was about to launch the country into a new, brutal chapter of forced industrialization and collectivization, ending the brief economic breathing space and plunging the Soviet Union into another period of massive upheaval. The foundations of the totalitarian state laid in these early years were now complete, with a single all-powerful leader at the top. And that's where we'll leave it for today. This period from 1922 to 1928 is absolutely crucial for understanding how the Soviet Union evolved, from a revolutionary dream into a totalitarian dictatorship. It's a story of compromise, repression, and a ruthless political struggle that set the stage for the terrifying decades to come. When Lenin died, a power struggle erupted. The man who came out on top, Joseph Stalin, would forge the Soviet Union into a superpower through sheer force of will, at a cost that still staggers the imagination. This is the story of the Stalin era. By the late 1920s, Stalin had consolidated his power and was ready to launch his revolution from above. The Soviet Union was still a largely agrarian peasant society. Stalin was determined to change that, and fast. His vision was a series of ambitious 5-year plans designed to drag the country into the industrial age. The focus was relentless: heavy industry. Steel, coal, tractors, and machinery became the new gods. Gigantic new factories and industrial cities, like Magnitogorsk, sprang up from the barren steppe, built with a mix of revolutionary fervor and brutal coercion. The goal was to catch up with the West in a single decade. But to fund this industrial leap, Stalin turned his attention to the countryside. He declared war on the old way of life. Private farming was to be eliminated and replaced with collectivization. Millions of peasants were forced off their land and herded into massive state-controlled collective farms, the kolkhozy. This was justified as a way to create a more efficient, modern agricultural system that could feed the new industrial cities and export grain for cash. The policy was a disaster. The peasants resisted fiercely. They slaughtered their livestock rather than hand them over to the state. The most prosperous peasants, labeled kulaks, were declared enemies of the people. They were to be liquidated as a class. Hundreds of thousands were executed or deported to the frozen wastelands of Siberia. This violent campaign against the peasantry shattered the agricultural backbone of the country. Chaos ensued, leading to a catastrophic drop in food production. The result was one of the worst man-made famines in history. From 1932 to 1933, devastating hunger swept across several regions. In Ukraine, the famine, known as the Holodomor, was particularly horrific, killing millions. It was a famine born not of crop failure, but of state policy. Grain was forcibly requisitioned from starving villagers to meet state quotas. People were left to eat grass, bark, and sometimes each other. The human cost of Stalin's industrial dream was becoming terrifyingly clear. To fuel his industrial machine and deal with the millions branded as enemies, Stalin expanded a system of forced labor camps that would become infamous, the Gulag. This vast archipelago of prisons and labor camps stretched across the Soviet Union. Prisoners from political dissenters and kulaks, two common criminals and people arrested for telling the wrong joke, were forced to work in the most brutal conditions imaginable. They built canals, mined for gold, and logged timber in the Arctic North, all under the watchful eye of the secret police. The Gulag became an essential part of the Soviet economy, a shadow empire built on slavery and death. By the mid-1930s, Stalin's paranoia, which had always been present, spiraled into a full-blown reign of terror. Fearing rivals and seeing conspiracies everywhere, he unleashed the Great Terror. This was a systematic purge of the Communist Party, the military, the intelligentsia, and society at large. The terror began with show trials of old Bolshevik leaders, men who had been Lenin's comrades. They were forced to confess to absurd crimes of being spies, saboteurs, and traitors before being executed. But it didn't stop there. The purges cascaded downwards. High-ranking military commanders, including the brilliant Marshal Tukhachevsky, were arrested and shot, gutting the Red Army's leadership just years before a major war. Engineers, scientists, writers, artists, and ordinary citizens were swept up in the wave of arrests. Neighbors denounced neighbors, children denounced parents. The secret police, the NKVD, had quotas to fill. A knock on the door in the middle of the night could mean a trip to the basement of the Lubyanka prison for interrogation, and a bullet to the back of the head or a long journey to the Gulag. By the time the terror subsided in late 1938, hundreds of thousands had been executed, and millions more were imprisoned. Stalin had created a society held together by absolute fear. As he was terrorizing his own people, Stalin was also playing a high-stakes game of international politics. He saw the rising power of Nazi Germany as a threat, but he also deeply distrusted the Western democracies, Britain and France. In a stunning and cynical move in August 1939, he signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Hitler. Publicly, it was a non-aggression treaty. Secretly, it contained a protocol that divided Eastern Europe into Nazi and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland was to be carved up, and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would fall under Soviet control. A week after the pact was signed, Hitler invaded Poland and World War II began. Stalin followed, sending the Red Army into eastern Poland. For nearly 2 years, Stalin seemed to believe his pact with Hitler would hold. He supplied Germany with vital raw materials while he consolidated his own gains, even fighting a costly war with Finland. He ignored repeated warnings from his own spies and from Winston Churchill that Hitler was planning to betray him. Then, on June 22, 1941, the betrayal came. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers stormed across the Soviet border. Stalin was reportedly shocked into a state of paralysis for days. The Red Army, decapitated by the purges and caught completely by surprise, was shattered. German panzer divisions raced deep into Soviet territory, encircling and capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. In the first few months, it looked as if the Soviet Union would collapse. The Germans reached the gates of Moscow and laid siege to Leningrad. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. Stalin, recovering his nerve, rallied the nation in a radio address. He appealed not to communism, but to Russian patriotism. This was not just a war. It was the Great Patriotic War. The sheer size of the country, the brutal Russian winter, and the incredible resilience and sacrifice of the Soviet people began to slow the German advance. The war on the Eastern Front became a struggle of annihilation, a titanic clash of ideologies fought with unparalleled ferocity. The turning point came at the Battle of Stalingrad, from late 1942 to early 1943. The Red Army and the German Sixth Army fought a hellish street-by-street battle for control of the city that bore Stalin's name. In the end, the encircled German army was forced to surrender. It was the first major defeat for the Nazis, and it electrified the Allied world. From Stalingrad, the tide began to turn. Another massive victory at the tank battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 sealed Germany's fate on the Eastern Front. The Red Army, now a seasoned and powerful fighting force, began its long, bloody march west. They drove the Germans out of the Soviet Union and fought their way across Eastern Europe, all the way to Berlin. The cost was astronomical. The Soviet Union suffered more casualties than any other nation in the war, with estimates of military and civilian deaths reaching as high as 27 million people. But in May 1945, it was Soviet soldiers who raised the red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. The war transformed the Soviet Union into a global superpower, but it also laid the foundations for a new conflict. As the Red Army liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis, it stayed. Pro-Soviet communist regimes were installed in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere, creating what Winston Churchill would soon call the Iron Curtain. The wartime alliance between the USSR and the West fractured, giving way to the decades-long standoff of the Cold War. In the final years of his life, Stalin's power was absolute. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, ending the American nuclear monopoly and ratcheting up Cold War tensions. The paranoia and terror continued, with new purges and anti-Semitic campaigns being planned. He ruled through fear to the very end. Then, in March 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The man who had industrialized a nation, defeated Hitler, and built a nuclear-armed empire at the cost of millions of his own people, was gone. His legacy was a country that was both a mighty superpower and a deeply traumatized society. The era of Stalin was over, but the shadow he cast would linger for decades to come. Imagine a giant, monolithic empire suddenly losing its absolute ruler. That's the Soviet Union in 1953 after Joseph Stalin's death. The air is thick with fear and uncertainty. Who could possibly fill those shoes? Out of the power struggle, a surprisingly complex figure emerges: Nikita Khrushchev. He wasn't just another party official. He was a man who would shake the foundations of the very system he inherited. In 1956, Khrushchev did the unthinkable. In a closed session of the 20th Party Congress, he delivered what became known as the secret speech. He didn't just criticize Stalin. He denounced his cult of personality, his purges, his crimes. It was a political earthquake. This speech kicked off a period of de-Stalinization. Gulag gates creaked open, releasing millions of political prisoners. A cultural thaw began, allowing a breath of fresh air into literature and art, something unimaginable just a few years earlier. But how far could this thaw go? The answer came swiftly and brutally. When Hungary rose up in 1956, demanding real freedom and an end to Soviet domination, Khrushchev didn't hesitate. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, crushing the rebellion. The message was clear. The Kremlin would allow criticism of a dead dictator, but it would not tolerate any challenge to its power over Eastern Europe. The iron fist, though perhaps hidden in a slightly looser glove, was still there. While wrestling with its dark past, the USSR was simultaneously reaching for the stars. The space race was on, and in the early days, the Soviets were winning, hands down. In 1957, the world listened in awe to the faint beeps of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite orbiting the Earth. It was a massive technological and propaganda victory. Then, in 1961, they did it again. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. His famous words, "Poyakali," let's go, echoing across the globe. For a moment, the Soviet system seemed not just viable, but superior, a model for the future. But just as they reached for the heavens, the world teetered on the brink of apocalypse. In 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The world held its breath for 13 terrifying days. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis. U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in a high-stakes standoff. A nuclear chess game where one wrong move could mean global annihilation. Thankfully, back-channel negotiations led to a compromise. The Soviets would remove the missiles from Cuba, and in a secret part of the deal, the U.S. would later quietly remove its own missiles from Turkey. The crisis was averted, but it left a permanent scar, a terrifying reminder of how close they had come. Khrushchev's risk-taking and unpredictable style, combined with agricultural failures, made him enemies within the party elite. In 1964, while he was on vacation, his colleagues staged a palace coup. He was unceremoniously removed from power. The era of the impulsive, shoe-banging peasant reformer was over. His replacement was the quintessential apparatchik, Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev's role was the polar opposite of Khrushchev's. Where Khrushchev was chaotic, Brezhnev represented stability, as it would later be called, stagnation. The early Brezhnev years saw the USSR reach the peak of its global power. Its military achieved nuclear parity with the United States. This newfound balance led to a period of détente, or a relaxation of tensions. Brezhnev and U.S. presidents signed major arms control treaties like SALT, trying to put a cap on the terrifying nuclear arms race. But this détente was fragile. Beneath the surface of superpower summits, the ideological conflict never stopped. The USSR continued to support communist movements worldwide, and the US continued to oppose them. The final nail in the coffin for détente came in Tijo. The Soviet Union made a fateful decision to invade Afghanistan to prop up a struggling communist government. They expected a quick operation. Instead, they walked into a decade-long quagmire. The war became the USSR's Vietnam, bloody, costly, and demoralizing conflict that drained the treasury and shattered the morale of the Red Army. It drew international condemnation and reignited the Cold War. Back home, the Brezhnev era was defined by a creeping decay. The command economy, which had once industrialized a nation, was now grinding to a halt. While the military-industrial complex churned out tanks and missiles, store shelves were often empty. Shortages of basic consumer goods became a chronic feature of daily life. A joke from the era went, "We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us." A vast black market and systemic corruption became the real engines of the economy. Outwardly, the Soviet Union looked like a stable, powerful empire. Internally, it was rotting from the core. The system was sclerotic, unable to adapt or innovate. When Brezhnev finally died in 1982 after a long illness, he was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief. Andropov recognized the deep-seated problems and tried to launch anti-corruption campaigns. But he was already old and sick, ruling for only 15 months. He was followed by Konstantin Chernenko, an even older and more infirm Brezhnev loyalist, who lasted just 13 months. The sight of these frail elderly leaders leading a superpower became a grim symbol of the system's own exhaustion. The USSR was an empire adrift, its leadership physically and ideologically spent. The era of stagnation had reached its logical dead end. A profound change wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. The stage was set for a new, dynamic leader who would try to reform the system. And in doing so, accidentally bring it all crashing down.
Imagine it's 1985. The Soviet Union is a global superpower, but its economy is creaking. Its people are restless, and its leaders are old and out of touch. The world is locked in the Cold War, a standoff between two ideological titans. Then, a new face appears on the world stage: Mikhail Gorbachev. At 54, he's the youngest Soviet leader in decades, a breath of fresh air promising renewal and change. He looks charismatic, energetic, and ready to tackle the deep-seated problems plaguing the country. Little did anyone know, his attempts to save the Soviet system would ultimately lead to its spectacular downfall. This is the story of how one man's reforms unleashed a whirlwind of change that redrew the map of the world. Gorbachev's grand plan had two key parts. First, perestroika, which means restructuring. The idea was to inject some life into the stagnant, state-controlled economy. He wanted to introduce elements of market mechanics, give more autonomy to state-owned enterprises, and maybe even allow some private businesses. It was a bold move, an attempt to fix the Soviet economic engine without completely replacing it. The second part was glasnost, or openness. This was even more revolutionary. Gorbachev believed that for perestroika to work, people needed to be able to talk openly about the country's problems. He eased censorship, allowed for more freedom of speech, and encouraged a more transparent government. He thought this would build trust and get people energized for his reforms. He wanted to create a more humane, more dynamic form of socialism. But opening the floodgates of information in a country built on secrets would have consequences he could never have predicted. At first, glasnost was electrifying. For the first time in generations, people could speak their minds without the constant fear of the KGB. Newspapers started printing articles critical of the government. Historians began to uncover the dark secrets of the past that had been buried for decades. The truth about Stalin's purges, the horrors of the Gulag, the man-made famines that killed millions in Ukraine. It all came pouring out. People learned about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster not through sanitized official reports, but through first-hand accounts of negligence and cover-ups. This new wave of truth was devastating for the Communist Party. Its entire claim to moral authority was built on a carefully constructed and largely false version of history. As the lies were exposed, the party's legitimacy crumbled. People began to ask, if they lied about all this, what else are they lying about? The very foundation of the Soviet state began to erode, not from external attack, but from the truth coming from within. While glasnost was stirring up the past, perestroika was struggling with the present. Gorbachev's economic reforms were a confusing mix of old and new. He'd tinker with central planning, but wouldn't fully embrace a market economy. The result was chaos. Factory managers, used to taking orders from Moscow, didn't know how to operate with their newfound freedom. The old supply chains broke down, but new ones didn't form to replace them. This led to massive shortages of basic goods. Store shelves grew emptier and emptier. People would stand in line for hours for bread, soap, or shoes. To make matters worse, the government started printing more money to cover its deficits, which caused inflation to skyrocket. People's life savings were wiped out. Instead of making life better, perestroika seemed to be making it worse. The initial optimism had for Gorbachev soured into frustration and anger. He was losing support from the very people he was trying to help. While things were unraveling at home, Gorbachev was also making huge changes to Soviet foreign policy. He declared that the Soviet Union would no longer use military force to keep its Eastern European satellite states in line. This was a radical departure from the past. Remember the tanks rolling into Hungary in '56 or Czechoslovakia in '68? Gorbachev was saying, "Those days are over." He believed that the socialist bloc should be a voluntary alliance of friendly nations, not an empire held together by a gun. He called it the Sinatra Doctrine. They could do it their way. This announcement sent a shockwave across Eastern Europe. For the first time in 40 years, the people in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and elsewhere saw a real chance for freedom. The door to a different future had just been unlocked. And then, in 1989, that door was kicked wide open. It was a year of revolution, a political whirlwind that no one saw coming. It started in Poland, where the Solidarity trade union, once banned, won a stunning victory in semi-free elections. Then Hungary opened its border with Austria, creating a hole in the Iron Curtain. Thousands of East Germans flew south through this gap to the west. Protests erupted across East Germany, culminating in one of the most iconic moments of the 20th century. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, was opened. People streamed through, chipping away at the wall with hammers and pickaxes, dancing on top of it in a scene of pure joy. It was a domino effect. Communist regimes in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania crumbled one after another, most of them peacefully. The empire Stalin had built after World War II disintegrated in a matter of months. And true to his word, Gorbachev kept the Soviet tanks in their barracks. The spirit of independence didn't stop at the Soviet border. It jumped right over it. The various republics that made up the USSR, many of which had been forcibly absorbed into the Union, saw what was happening in Eastern Europe and thought, why not us? nationalist movements, long suppressed, surged with new life. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been independent before World War II, were the first to make their move, declaring their intent to restore their sovereignty. Unrest flared up in the Caucasus region, in Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And most crucially, in Ukraine, a huge and economically vital republic, a powerful independence movement called ROK gained massive popular support. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was starting to look less like a union and more like a collection of nations straining to break free. The very glue holding the country together was dissolving. By 1991, Gorbachev was caught in an impossible position. The hardline communists blamed him for losing Eastern Europe and for letting the country fall into chaos. They saw him as a traitor to the cause. On the other side, radical reformers, led by the charismatic and populist Boris Yeltsin. The newly elected president of the Russian Republic felt Gorbachev wasn't moving fast enough. They wanted to dismantle the old system completely. In August 1991, the hardliners made their move. While Gorbachev was on vacation, a group of top officials, including the KGB chief and the defense minister, announced they were taking control to restore order. They declared a state of emergency and sent tanks into Moscow. It was a coup, but they fatally miscalculated. Instead of being cowed, the people of Moscow poured into the streets to protest. They were led by Boris Yeltsin, who climbed atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building and defiantly called for resistance. The coup leaders were disorganized and lost their nerve. After just 3 days, the coup collapsed. The failed coup was the final nail in the coffin for the Soviet Union. It completely discredited the old guard communists and the institutions they represented. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his power was gone. The real hero of the hour was Boris Yeltsin. He had stood up to the tanks and won. In the aftermath, republic after republic declared full independence. The central government of the USSR had become an empty shell. The end came in December 1991. The leaders of the 3 most important Slavic republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, met secretly and signed an accord dissolving the Soviet Union. They declared it was being replaced by a loose, voluntary alliance called the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS. A few weeks later, Gorbachev officially resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. On the night of December 25, 1991, the iconic red Soviet flag, with its hammer and sickle, was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place, the white, blue, and red tricolor of pre-revolutionary Russia was raised. After 74 years, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had officially ceased to exist. An empire had collapsed, a global superpower had vanished, and the Cold War was over. It was a seismic event that reshaped the world. And it all began with one man's attempt to reform an unreformable system. Gorbachev set out to renew socialism, but instead, he accidentally presided over its demise, unleashing forces of history that no one, not even him, could control. December 1991. The Soviet flag is lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. A new era begins, not with a bang, but with a whimper of economic desperation. The brand new Russian Federation, led by President Boris Yeltsin, is born into a world of chaos. The old system is gone, but what comes next? Yeltsin's answer was bold, radical, and for many, devastating. He called it shock therapy. Imagine waking up one day to find the price of bread, milk, and everything you need has skyrocketed overnight. That was the reality for millions as Yeltsin's government freed prices from state control. The idea was to jolt the comatose command economy back to life, creating a free market almost instantly. But that was only half the plan. The other half was mass privatization. Factories, oil fields, mines, the vast wealth of the Soviet state was put up for sale. In theory, every citizen received a voucher, a small share in this national sell-off. The slogan was a nation of property owners. The reality? Most people were so poor they sold their vouchers for cash just to survive. These vouchers, along with huge chunks of state assets, were scooped up by a handful of well-connected, ruthless businessmen. These were the original oligarchs. They became billionaires overnight, while the life savings of ordinary Russians were wiped out by hyperinflation. Poverty wasn't just a problem. It became a national crisis. The promise of a prosperous, democratic Russia seemed to be turning into a nightmare of inequality and despair. As the economy spiraled, so did the politics. By 1993, Russia was on the brink of civil war. On one side was President Yeltsin, determined to push through his radical reforms. On the other, the Russian parliament, full of communists and nationalists who saw him as a Western puppet destroying the country. The power struggle became a constitutional crisis. Who really held power? The president or the parliament? The standoff paralyzed the government. Protesters filled the streets of Moscow, some supporting Yeltsin, others calling for his overthrow. The tension was unbearable. In October 1993, the world watched in horror as the conflict exploded. Anti-Yeltsin demonstrators, some armed, stormed government buildings. Yeltsin responded with overwhelming force. He declared a state of emergency and called in the army. Tanks, loyal to the president, surrounded the Russian White House, the parliament building. The order was given to fire. The shelling of his own parliament was a shocking sight, broadcast live across the globe. It was a brutal end to the standoff. The rebellion was crushed, and Yeltsin's power was secured, but at a terrible cost. The image of a democratic Russia was literally scarred by tank shells. A new constitution was pushed through, granting the president vast powers. The crisis was over, but the deep divisions in Russian society remained. While Moscow wrestled with its demons, the edges of the vast Russian Federation began to fray. In the Caucasus Mountains, the small Republic of Chechnya saw an opportunity. Declaring full independence, its charismatic leader, Johar Dudayev, challenged Moscow's authority directly. For Yeltsin, this was a red line. Allowing Chechnya to secede could trigger a domino effect, tearing the entire federation apart. After initial attempts to destabilize the Chechen government failed, Yeltsin made a fateful decision. In December 1994, Russian troops rolled into Chechnya to restore constitutional order. The Kremlin expected a quick, victorious police action. What they got was the First Chechen War. The Chechen fighters, though vastly outnumbered and outgunned, knew their mountainous terrain and fought with ferocious determination. The Russian army, poorly trained, demoralized, and unprepared for a guerrilla war, suffered staggering losses. The capture of the capital, Grozny, turned into a month-long bloodbath, leveling the city and causing immense civilian casualties. The war was brutal, televised, and deeply unpopular back in Russia. It exposed the weakness and incompetence of the military and stained Yeltsin's presidency. After 2 years of vicious fighting, a humiliated Russian army withdrew. A fragile peace treaty was signed, leaving Chechnya de facto independent, but its status unresolved. The war was a bleeding wound, a symbol of the chaos and violence of the 1990s. By the mid-90s, Yeltsin's popularity was at rock bottom. The economic pain, the political chaos, the bloody war in Chechnya all took its toll. His health was failing, and his public appearances were often erratic. Yet, in the 1996 presidential election, he faced a stark choice: re-elect the flawed Yeltsin or risk a return to communism under his main rival. The oligarchs, who owed their fortunes to Yeltsin, rallied behind him. They poured millions into his campaign and used their media empires to paint him as the only alternative to a Soviet restoration. It worked. Yeltsin won, but it was a victory that made him even more dependent on the powerful men who had saved his presidency. Just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, they did. In 1998, the House of Cards collapsed. Years of shaky finances, low oil prices, and the aftershock of the Asian financial crisis culminated in a total meltdown. In August 1998, the Russian government defaulted on its domestic debt. It declared it could no longer pay its bills. At the same time, the ruble was devalued and went into freefall. Its value against the dollar plummeted. For ordinary Russians, this was the final betrayal. Any remaining trust in the government, in banks, in the market economy evaporated. The small but growing middle class was wiped out. The 1998 financial crisis was a national trauma, cementing the 90s in the popular imagination as a time of poverty, chaos, and humiliation. The end of the decade found Russia weak, bankrupt, and searching for a strong hand to restore order. Yeltsin, now a frail and deeply unpopular figure, was shuffling through prime ministers desperate to find a successor who could hold the country together and protect him and his family from future prosecution. In August 1999, he made his final and most consequential appointment. He named a little-known former KGB officer as his new prime minister. His name was Vladimir Putin. Putin's rise was meteoric. He projected an image of toughness and competence, launching a new, more brutal war in Chechnya after a series of apartment bombings in Russia, which he blamed on Chechen terrorists. His approval ratings soared. Then came the most dramatic moment of all. On New Year's Eve, December 31, 1999, Boris Yeltsin appeared on television. Looking tired and emotional, he did something no Russian leader had ever done. He resigned. He asked the people for forgiveness for the mistakes he had made, for the hopes he had not fulfilled. With his resignation, his prime minister, Vladimir Putin, automatically became acting president. The chaotic, tumultuous, and often tragic decade of the 1990s was over. As the world celebrated the new millennium, Russia entered a new era under a new leader who promised to end the chaos and restore the power of the state. Imagine it's New Year's Eve, 1999. A surprise announcement shocks Russia. President Boris Yeltsin is resigning. His chosen successor, a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin, takes over. This moment marks the beginning of a new era for Russia, one that would see it transform from a nation in chaos to an assertive global power, all under the steady hand of one man. Putin's rise to power in 2000 was no accident. He was seen as the strong leader needed to steer Russia out of the turbulent 1990s, a decade marked by economic collapse, political instability, and a sense of national humiliation. And for many Russians, he delivered. His first major act was to re-centralize power, pulling authority back into the Kremlin that had been scattered among regional governors and powerful business magnates known as oligarchs. He methodically brought major media outlets, especially television stations, under state control. This allowed the Kremlin to shape the national narrative and ensure a favorable portrayal of its policies. Oligarchs who had wielded immense political influence during the Yeltsin years were faced with a choice: stay out of politics or face the consequences. Those who defied him, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky of the oil giant Yukos, found themselves imprisoned and their assets seized. This sent a clear message. The era of competing power centers was over. Fortuitously for Putin, the early 2000s saw a massive spike in global oil and gas prices. As one of the world's largest energy exporters, Russia's economy boomed. This newfound wealth fueled a period of significant economic growth and a noticeable improvement in living standards for many ordinary Russians. Pensions were paid on time, salaries rose, and a sense of stability returned. Putin was widely credited with this turnaround, solidifying his image as the man who restored order and national pride. On the security front, Putin took a much harder line. The Second Chechen War, which had begun in 1999, was prosecuted with overwhelming force. The capital city Grozny was leveled, and the separatist rebellion was brutally crushed. Chechnya was brought back under firm federal control, governed by a loyal local regime led by the Kadyrov family. This tough approach was popular at home, reinforcing Putin's reputation as a decisive leader who would not tolerate challenges to Russia's territorial integrity. By 2008, Putin's Russia was feeling more confident and assertive on the world stage. This new confidence was put to the test in August of that year. Following escalating tensions with its neighbor Georgia over the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, Russia launched a swift and decisive military intervention. The Five-Day War resulted in a Russian victory and its formal recognition of the two regions. Independence, a move condemned by the West, but which demonstrated Moscow's willingness to use force to protect its interests in its force. Its interests in its really near. That same year, Putin faced a constitutional hurdle. Term limits prevented him from running for a third consecutive presidential term. A clever solution was devised. His close ally, Dmitry Medvedev, was elected president, while Putin stepped into the role of prime minister. This tandem arrangement ensured that Putin remained at the heart of power. During Medvedev's presidency, there were some hints of a liberal thaw, with talk of modernization and reform. But it was clear who was ultimately in charge. In 2012, as expected, Putin returned to the presidency. This move, however, sparked the largest protests Russia had seen in years. Allegations of widespread fraud in the preceding parliamentary elections brought tens of thousands of people onto the streets of Moscow and other major cities. The protesters demanded fair elections and an end to Putin's rule. The Kremlin's response was firm. The protests were eventually suppressed, and new laws were passed that restricted public assembly and increased penalties for unauthorized demonstrations. The brief thaw was over. 2 years later, in 2014, Russia's relationship with the West would be irrevocably altered. Following a popular uprising in Ukraine that ousted its pro-Russian president, Russia moved swiftly. In a lightning-fast operation, Russian forces seized control of the Crimean Peninsula, which had a majority ethnic Russian population and housed a key Russian naval base. A hastily organized referendum, not recognized by the international community, showed overwhelming support for joining Russia. Moscow formally annexed Crimea shortly after. Simultaneously, a conflict erupted in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, where Russian-backed separatists declared independent republics. Russia denied direct military involvement, but provided significant support to the separatists. These actions triggered a wave of condemnation from the West. The United States and the European Union imposed sanctions on Russian officials, companies, and key sectors of the economy. Russia was expelled from the G8, and a new era of confrontation began. Reminiscent of the Cold War, internally, Putin continued to consolidate his power. In 2020, a nationwide vote approved a series of constitutional amendments. The most significant change was the resetting of presidential term limits, which would allow Putin to potentially run for 2 more 6-year terms after his current one ends in 2024. This move effectively opened the door for him to remain in power until 2036, cementing his place as Russia's longest-serving leader since Joseph Stalin. Then, on February 24, 2022, the world watched in shock as Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Moscow called it a special military operation aimed at demilitarizing and denazifying its neighbor. The invasion, the largest conventional military conflict in Europe since World War II, resulted in devastating casualties, a massive refugee crisis, and widespread destruction. The international response was swift and severe. The West unleashed an unprecedented barrage of sanctions, targeting Russia's financial system, its energy exports, and its access to technology. Russian assets were frozen, major companies pulled out of the country, and Russia became the most sanctioned nation in the world. In response, Moscow pivoted, seeking to deepen its economic and political ties with non-Western powers, most notably China, as well as countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The global geopolitical landscape was fundamentally reshaped. As we look at Russia today, we see a nation at a crossroads. It remains a formidable military power with a vast nuclear arsenal and a key player in global energy markets. Yet, it faces immense challenges. The ongoing war in Ukraine continues to drain its resources and manpower. Western sanctions are designed to cripple its economy over the long term. Demographically, Russia faces a shrinking and aging population, a problem exacerbated by war casualties and a wave of emigration. The political system, so heavily centralized around one leader, raises questions about the future and what happens after Putin. The story of post-Soviet Russia is still being written, a complex saga of restored power, renewed confrontation, and an uncertain future. Thank you for watching. If you found this overview insightful, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into modern history.